Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Chapter 58, Li Yueming, who was deep in thought. 1. He could feel Li Yueming's vigilance. Ma Baifan smiled awkwardly. He thought for a moment and then opened his mouth to complain. Sir, you don't know this. The Iron Fist Brotherhood is a malignant tumor among malignant tumors in our port city. It's fine if they bully men and women, burn, kill, and plunder. They also often kidnap and sell children in the city. All the citizens of our port city wish they could skin them alive and light the sky lanterns. It's a pity that I, the city lord, was born to study. I don't have a powerful martial artist like you under me. I'm also helpless against them. Listening to his complaints. Before figuring out this guy's purpose, Li Yueming would never reveal any extra information. Seeing that he was unmoved, Ma Baifan finally stopped being polite and changed to the main dish. The door suddenly appeared behind two servants with plates. The plate was about 60 centimeters long and wide, and the items placed in it were covered by a gray cloth. From the blurry outline, he was unable to determine what it was. Li Yueming and Wang Ermeize looked on in confusion. A servant slowly removed the cloth from the plate. Silver light bloomed. There were more than 10 high-quality silver ingots under the cloth. Before the two of them could come back to their senses, another servant came over with another plate. He opened the cloth and took a look. Golden light flashed. The second plate actually contained more than 10 shiny gold bars. Such a huge amount of wealth. Even Wang Ermeize, who was a martial artist, could not help but breathe faster. One had to know that it was currently a chaotic time. The banknotes issued by the Great Xia Imperial Court had long been reduced to worthless toilet paper. The copper coins in various places were seriously adulterated due to the year-round shortage of caddy. Their purchasing power was also very ordinary. Only the real silver ingots and gold bars in front of him were the strongest currency in the world. A dozen gold bars and a dozen silver ingots. Even for a successful martial master, this was a considerable amount of wealth. Even Wang Ermeize, who was in the carriage, was blinded by the bright banknotes. He looked at his beloved little yellow croaker getting further and further away from him. Ma Baifan's face revealed a pained expression. However, he concealed this expression very well and did not show it clearly. After Li Yueming confirmed the number of gold bars, Ma Baifan endured the pain and waved his hand. A few servants placed the gold bars in front of them. This is a small gift from our port city. Please don't treat me as an outsider. He looked at the gold and silver in front of him. Wang Ermeize's face stiffened. He subconsciously turned around and glanced at Li Yueming. He did not dare to spend such a large sum of money on his own. Li Yueming was silent for a while. His indifferent eyes stared at Ma Baifan for a long time. In the end, he smiled and said, in that case, thank you for your kind intentions, City Lord. Hearing his agreement, Wang Ermeize hurriedly put away the 2 boxes of heavy treasures. Ma Baifan's face twitched again. After a while, he forced a smile and said, Lord Warrior, in order to thank you for your contribution to our port city, why don't you stay for a celebratory feast before leaving? As you can see, there are a lot of pedestrians in the morning on the pipeline between the port and Qingdu Port. It's not a big deal to leave at night. Li Yueming glanced at the horizon that was already rising and shook his head. To be honest, I have something important to do now, so I can't stay for long. Why don't I come back to talk to you after I'm done with my business at Qingdu Harbor? Ma Baifan thought for a moment and didn't insist. Instead, he turned around and waved his hand. Under the watchful eyes of Li Yueming and Wang Ermeize, a few soldiers brought over a thick piece of yellow paper. Ma Baifan took the pen and paper and wrote a customs clearance document. The official seal was stamped at the end. After the ink dried, he handed it to Li Yueming and said, "Since you have something important to attend to, I won't disturb you anymore. This is a customs clearance document. With this document, you can enter Kingdu Port without waiting in line. If you have any needs, you can also report to the authorities of Kingdu Port." Li Yueming smiled, took the document and said politely, "Sir, you're really a good official who's devoted to the people. I believe that with you around, the lives of the people in Ligong City will definitely become more and more prosperous." The city lord also smiled. After he took the document, he continued, "Take this document and just say my name when you enter Kingdu Port." Li Yueming naturally nodded repeatedly, and the smile on his face never stopped. Under Ma Baifan's warm farewell, the three of them finally left the port. Looking at the tall and sturdy city walls behind him, he could see that they were moving further and further away. Is City Lord Ma that generous? Wang Ermeza scratched his head. She gave him money and documents. Lo am so embarrassed. What do you think? Li Yueming asked with a faint smile. Wang Ermeza pondered for a while. In the end, he shook his head. Li Yueming was amused and shook his head. If this guy was really a good official, his head would have been hung on the city wall by now. Wang Ermeza didn't understand at first. After pondering for a while, "Oh, how can this guy be a good official? He must have bad intentions for giving us so many things." Although the city was still under the government's control in name, it was still under the control of the government. But in reality, the government had long since ceased to exist. Under such circumstances, Ma Baifan became the city lord of the city. How could he be clean under his butt? Just like what Li Yueming said. If Ma Baifan's bottom was really clean. If that was the case, his head would have been hung on the city wall not long after he left Port City. No matter what Ma Baifan's intentions were, he had already gotten the gold. He was a money giver. Who wouldn't like it? As for the rest, who cares? Anyway, it was impossible to plot against him without him knowing. Li Yueming took out the customs clearance document from his pocket. After examining it for a moment, he put it back into his pocket. If nothing unexpected happened, as long as he dared to enter Kingdu Port with this document, in a few minutes, the members of the Iron Fist Brotherhood would come knocking on their door. According to the normal process of deduction, after the Iron Fist Brotherhood found them and killed them all, this batch of gold bars and silver naturally fell into the hands of the Iron Fist Brotherhood. In this way, City Lord Ma managed to keep his own life through this operation. The only thing he lost was the money he had scraped from the hands of the people after being an official for many years. Only Li Yueming became a completely wronged person. Not only did he help Ma Baifan transport a cart of gold and silver for free, but he also threw himself into the net and gave a head to the Iron Fist Brotherhood to vent their anger. It had to be said that his methods were brilliant. Even Li Yueming had to ponder over it before he could figure out the ins and outs of it. So this world was really dark. On the surface, the city lord and the gang were enemies, but in fact, they had a tacit understanding of each other. The so-called fairness and justice were a complete joke in such a corrupt and withered world. Therefore, would martial artists be able to transcend it? He looked at the pile of gold and silver treasures in his carriage. Li Yueming fell into deep thought. Chapter 59, A Slaughter Along the Way, Shocking Kingdu Port. 1. Li Yueming could faintly smell the salty sea breeze in the air. He lifted the curtain and looked outside. At the end of his line of sight, an extremely imposing city appeared. The traffic below the city was like a weaving web. There was a long line of people entering the city. He felt the doubt in Li Yueming's eyes. Wang Ermeza was very excited. He introduced, "Young master, this is Kingdu Port, the busiest city in the entire Clear Spring County. Even the county town is not as prosperous as one-third of it." Li Yueming nodded perfunctorily. In his heart, he was thinking about how to find the girl who was kidnapped by the Iron Fist Brotherhood as soon as possible. As a hotshot, it was obviously impossible for the girl to die suddenly. However, it was a troublesome matter to find him in such a port city that was mixed with good and bad people. Fortunately, City Lord Ma gave him an inspiration before he left. Otherwise, Li Yueming would probably have to come up with a plan. Wang Ermeza didn't have much of an idea. After all, he had no idea who the girl Li Yueming was talking about was. In his opinion, Li Yueming's main purpose for coming to this port was to join a certain dojo. Then, he would officially step onto the path of martial arts and soar into the sky. He looked at the city that was getting closer and closer. "Young master, have you decided which martial arts school you want to join?" Wang Ermezi asked carefully. "I'm an in-name disciple of an ordinary martial master in the Qingduport Martial Arts School. Although I don't have much hope of advancing because of my age, I can still barely speak a few words with my master. A dojo or something." If he had time, he would definitely go and exchange some feelings. However, the most important thing now was to find that girl. Li Yueming shook his head. "Don't worry about the martial arts club. We'll talk about it after we enter the city." As they conversed, the carriage had already arrived at the city. Qingduport also had a passageway that was exclusive to martial artists. Even the passage into the city that was specially used by martial artists was already filled with long lines. He looked at the long line in front of him. Li Yueming took out the customs clearance document and handed it to Wang Ermeza. "Hand this thing over to the soldiers. Let me see how useful City Lord Ma's face fruit is." Wang Ermeza didn't know what the face fruit was. He looked at the customs clearance document in his hand. After hesitating for a moment, he braced himself and asked, "Young master, didn't you say that there was something wrong with this thing?" Li Yueming grinned. "Isn't it better if there's a problem?" he asked, revealing a mouthful of clean white teeth. "City Lord Ma saved me a lot of effort." He looked at the smile on Li Yueming's face. Wang Ermeza felt a chill down his spine. Based on his understanding of Li Yueming during this period of time, as long as his young master showed this expression, it meant that someone was going to be in trouble. However, even so, Wang Ermeza still felt a little frightened. Qingduport was the headquarters of the Iron Fist Brotherhood, and there were close to 1,000 martial artists in it. Even if most of them were only martial apprentices, that was also a force that could not be underestimated. Wang Ermeza wisely chose to shut his mouth. He dismounted from his horse and found a soldier standing guard, handing over the customs clearance document. The moment the soldier saw the document, his expression changed. He raised his head and looked at Wang Ermezi and Li Yueming, who was not far away. "Please wait a moment, I'll report this to the captain." As he spoke, the soldier ran towards the city gate without looking back. 10 minutes later, it was a long time ago. A small door on the other side of the martial artist passageway opened, and a few soldiers ran out to hold Li Yueming's reins. Under the astonished gazes of countless martial artists and ordinary people, Li Yueming's carriage swaggered past all the people waiting in line and entered the Qing capital from the side door. Behind the door, more than 500 members of the Iron Fist Brotherhood were gathered here. Clearly, they had been waiting for a long time. He looked at Li Ming on the carriage. A skinny man in his 30s from the Brotherhood sneered, "Should I say that you're bold, or should I say that you don't know what's good for you?" Li Yueming got off the carriage. Looking at the crowd of Brotherhood members, he said, "Is there a possibility that you're the one who doesn't know what's good for you?" The skinny man's expression changed several times. She opened her mouth but nothing came out. He turned around and waved his hand. Immediately, a large group of Brotherhood members rushed over with weapons such as axes and machetes. Li Yueming looked excited. This kind of battle that surpassed his limits was the best whetstone for him. He could use this opportunity to polish every inch of his physique to the fullest in battle. The battle was about to begin. They fought from sunset until 10 o'clock at night. The entire kingdom was shaken. This was the first time that countless martial artists realized what a monster was. Li Yueming was like a killing machine that didn't know fatigue. He kept running the breathing technique to absorb the blood and qi in the martial artist's body to polish his body. Moreover, as time continued to pass, not only did his strength not decrease, but it was also constantly getting stronger. His moves became more and more ruthless. The power that exploded out became more and more terrifying. Under the watchful eyes of the surrounding soldiers guarding the city, many people of all walks of life entered the city. Li Yueming had single-handedly killed more than 300 of the 500 elite members of the Iron Blood Brotherhood. The remaining 200 people were scared out of their wits. All of them fled like crazy. They only hated that they weren't given extra legs when they were born. As a result, there was no way to escape this hell-like city and the man who was more terrifying than hell. He wiped the sticky blood off his face. Although there was a breathing technique that could absorb the energy in the blood mist to replenish his stamina, he could not help but feel a little nervous. However, such a high-intensity battle was also very taxing on the body. He had killed more than 300 Brotherhood members and cut down countless swords. His body had already reached the limit of what it could withstand. If he continued, he would have to squeeze out his lifespan. Although lifespan was a boring thing to Li Yueming, it was just a consumable. However, it was obviously not worth it to spend it on a group of gangsters. He resisted the tiredness in his body. Li Yueming stopped the Iron Fist Brotherhood's leader who was running for his life. She looked at the man in front of her who was already scared out of his wits. "Where are the children sent to last night?" Li Yueming asked with narrowed eyes. The chief was a very ordinary martial master. He could not even last for 30 moves before his weapon was broken by Li Yueming, who was channeling his breathing technique. He had been looking for an opportunity to escape in the battle that followed. However, Li Yueming was staring at him. Until now. Only then did he realize who he had offended. He did not dare to hide anything. The gang leader trembled and said, They were sent to the dental shop. Some of them are of good quality in the auction house opened by foreigners." He got the answer. Li Yueming raised his knife and ended the other party's life. He turned around and said to Wang Ermeize, who was guarding the carriage to protect his mother, "Drive me to the auction house." Wang Ermeize's entire head felt numb. He heard Li Yueming calling him. Only then did his brain recover from the stress response. He looked around the carriage at the broken limbs. Who am I? Where am I? What was the meaning of life? Young Master slaughtered the headquarters of the Iron Blood Brotherhood in Qingdu Harbor. Did the author become longer? In addition, the basic preparations were almost complete. Next up, the author is going to start sprinting to the top. Hold on tight to your seat belt. Chapter 60, Changing Fate Again. The entrance of the Green Capital Harbor was silent. Li Yueming's feat of defeating the entire Iron Fist Brotherhood had already frightened many people. The entire city gate was covered in blood. Broken limbs were still dripping blood everywhere. Li Yueming wiped the blood off his face. He raised his head and looked around. Feeling his cold gaze, the thousands of onlookers around the city gate could not help but swallow their saliva. Among this group of people, there were many bandits who killed without blinking. There were also quite a number of pirates who were wanted by 1,000 miles drifting. However, no matter who it was, no matter what identity it was, when he was targeted by Li Yueming, he would feel a chill run down his spine. Probably only those who were truly on the verge of death. That was why he felt how terrifying Li Yueming was at this moment. The person in front of him was the real Ren Tuesday. Under everyone's watchful eyes, he killed hundreds of martial artists without even blinking. After making sure that there were no survivors of the Iron Fist Brotherhood in the surroundings, Li Yueming turned around and looked at Wang Ermeizi, who was standing beside the carriage not far away. He said, "Come, bring me to the auction house." Wang Ermeizi woke up from a dream. He hurriedly pulled the carriage over. Li Yueming did not lift the curtain. After all, his mother had never seen such a scene before. It was not good to be frightened. The three of them drove the carriage out of the pile of corpses. There was a long bloody mark under the wheel of the carriage. All the onlookers moved away to make way for him as if they were avoiding a snake or scorpion. Li Yueming boarded the carriage and swaggered away. All that was left were corpses strewn all over the ground. Including the officials, no one dared to stand up and say a word. About an hour later, Li Yueming came to the entrance of the auction house that the Iron Fist Brotherhood leader had mentioned. Just as Li Yueming was about to enter, a foreigner with yellow hair and white skin suddenly stood up and said in a Chinese language that was not very fluent, "Hello, sir. Please show me your invitation." Li Yueming's response was very decisive. He picked up a head from the back of the carriage. The moment he saw the head, the foreigner's expression changed drastically. He took out an old-fashioned flintlock from his pocket and said, "This is an international auction house set up by the Free States Dao Association. What are you trying to do?" He was a Gokyudo Grandmaster of Combat from the Free State. However, the Gokyudo path fighting level could only barely be considered the beginner level. Compared to his average strength, the flintlock he carried with him would give him a greater sense of security. Li Yueming casually tossed the head. "I don't have an invitation. How about using this person's head as an invitation?" The foreigner's face turned even uglier. However, when he saw the extremely familiar face on the head that had rolled to the ground, his eyelids twitched. After a few changes in his expression, in the end, he put away his gun and said with a decent etiquette, "Esteemed guest, please wait a moment. I'll go and explain the situation to the president. I believe he should let you in." Li Yueming glanced at him and didn't say anything else. The foreigner immediately jogged back to ask for instructions. If Li Yueming was an ordinary person, the foreigner must have treated Li Yueming to peanuts long ago. But now, Li Yueming's face was full of killing intent, and he was holding the head of the Iron Fist Brotherhood's leader in his hand. It was obvious that he was not an ordinary person. Unable to make up his mind, the foreigner ran to report to the higher UPS. About 5 minutes later, a tall white man in a suit walked out from backstage. The moment he saw Li Yueming, his eyes paused. The manager had always been in charge of the auction house. He did not know what had happened at the city gate. However, as the branch president of the auction house, he was not afraid. The foreigner in the suit naturally knew this. The person in front of him was a god of slaughter. Even if the auction house was powerful, they didn't want to offend it unnecessarily. The president first bowed to Li Yueming. "Sir, may I ask what you need from our Gokyudo auction house?" "I have a sister who was kidnapped by the Iron Fist Brotherhood," Li Yueming said. "I want to find her." The guild leader suddenly felt a headache. No wonder he was so murderous. So it was because the Iron Fist Brotherhood had captured his sister. He even dared to capture the sister of such a ruthless person. Did the Iron Fist brothers not know how to write the word death? The guild leader cursed the bunch of idiots from the Iron Fist Brotherhood 10,000 times in his heart. However, he remembered that this group of people had already gone to the Western Paradise. He suddenly felt that it was inappropriate. He hurriedly smiled and said, "I see. It's all a misunderstanding. Please follow me. We'll treat the children sent by the Iron Fist Brotherhood well." Li Yueming's murderous aura was slightly restrained. After nodding, he followed the manager to the backstage of the auction house. About 10 minutes later, Li Yueming saw a dozen children locked in cages. There were men and women. The biggest possibility was that he was only 4 or 5 years old. The oldest was only 7 or 8 years old. All of them had delicate features. It was obvious that the human traffickers had carefully selected them. In this group of people, Li Yueming soon found a little girl called Rura. The little girl was wearing brand new clothes. However, the expression on his face was a little numb. Her eyes were red as she stared at the iron bars. No one knew what she was thinking. Li Yueming glanced at the president and said, "Open the door." A foreigner who was responsible for guarding the children took out a bunch of keys from his pocket. Soon, the iron cage was brought over. The group of children watched all of this in fear and unease. The little girl's dull eyes subconsciously glanced at Li Yueming. Very quickly, her eyes revealed a look of disbelief as she said, "You are the big brother from before." Li Yueming did not answer. Silently, he carried her out of the cage. The girl was about 5 or 6 years old. However, compared to the strong Li Yueming, he was still a little guy who was not even as tall as his shoulders. He could easily lift it up. There were more than 10 children left in the cage. In the narrow iron cage of the middle city. The fear and helplessness on their faces could swallow everything. Li Yueming turned around and looked at the president. "One want all these people. Name a price." The president glanced at Li Yueming. He then glanced at the child in the cage. "In that case, we can give you a friendly price of 5 taels of silver." Li Yueming didn't say much. He took out a silver ingot from his pocket and threw it to the president. Then, he led the group of children and left without looking back. He looked at Li Yueming's back. The president of the auction house revealed a look of fear. However, after thinking about it, in the end, he did not make any substantial movements. After leaving the auction house, he looked at Li Yueming, who had a cold expression on his face. The little girl suddenly burst into tears. As she wiped her tears, she sobbed, "Brother, Mom died of illness. Why can't Xiaoro save Mom even after working so hard to earn money?" Li Yueming silently watched the street outside the carriage. He ignored her cries. It was still the cheap mother in the carriage who couldn't stand it. He patted the little girl's head and comforted her. This year, Li Yueming was 6 years old. Through this short journey, he finally had a basic understanding of this world. The voice of the reincarnation mark suddenly sounded in his mind. When you were 6 years old, you stepped out of the house for the first time. You learned a lot of martial arts knowledge without a teacher and displayed powerful combat strength that far exceeded your age. The score for this reincarnation has increased slightly. Additional reward of 4,000 reincarnation points. Chapter 61, 2 years, Soaring Dragon. He brought the girl named Fu Ziro to his side. Li Yueming didn't continue. After all, tempering one's physique could not be rushed in a short period of time. Now, he no longer needed to accumulate experience through combat. Absorbing the inspiration and experience from the previous battle was the most important thing for him at the moment. Only then could Li Yueming truly perfect the basic physical conditions of a martial apprentice. After all, this was a world where personal strength was supreme. Usually, the more solid the foundation was, the wider the road to growth. Advancing rashly without a solid foundation would only narrow his path. Li Yueming's ideal goal was not as simple as a martial king or a martial saint. He wanted to obtain a high score for the reincarnation mark. He had to walk to the point where there was no one before him or anyone else in the future before he could be considered complete. Countless people in the entire Kingdeport were discussing. Li Yueming asked Wang Ermeza to buy a remote courtyard at a high price. Then, there was no sound after she entered. This unpredictable behavior left the countless people in Kingdeport who were paying attention to his actions puzzled. When Li Yueming first entered the port, he was a fierce man. He directly massacred the entire Iron Fist Brotherhood with his blood. All the members of the Iron Fist Brotherhood around Kingdeport were scared out of their wits. Many gang members even fled inland, afraid that Li Yueming, the god of death, would come to them again if they were not careful. However, just when everyone thought that Li Yueming, who was in the limelight, would take this opportunity to make a scene, Li Yueming suddenly stopped moving. This strange behavior also led to many rumors about him in Qingduport for a long time. Some people said that Li Yueming was a core inner disciple of a certain section. He traveled thousands of miles just to find his kidnapped sister. There were also people who said that Li Yueming was seriously injured in the battle with the Iron Fist Brotherhood. The reason why he closed the door was because his injuries were too severe to move. All kinds of rumors were flying everywhere. At the most exaggerated time, no one dared to pass by the 2 streets around Li Yueming's mansion. However, as time passed, Li Yueming remained in his room, and there were no more topics to discuss. As time passed, not many people paid attention to it. After all, Qingduport was a very forgetful city. People from all over the world gathered here. Merchant, pirate, homeless refugee. Many of them came and went with the waves. No matter how outrageous and shocking the story was, it would eventually be swept away by the endless waves as time passed. A year later, Li Yueming was 7 years old. In this year, every day, besides eating and sleeping, he would shut himself in his room to meditate. The star-moon breathing technique could turn ordinary people into extraordinaires in the previous wasteland. However, in the world of martial Dao where the rules were more complete, the enhancement that it brought to Li Yueming was relatively ordinary. At the same time, he was digesting his battle knowledge. Li Yueming was also constantly modifying the details of the star-moon breathing technique through his infinite deduction talent. He wanted to transform it into a martial arts technique of a higher level. However, the idea was beautiful. The reality was a little more bone-chilling. This was because he had not cultivated or learned any martial techniques or cultivation techniques in this world. Li Yueming's progress in modifying the star-moon breathing technique was unusually slow. He had no choice but to stop the time-consuming and laborious project. Then, he continued to polish his body. 2 battles a year ago. His gains had already demolished Li Yueming's bod to an extreme level. An ordinary martial apprentice breaking a boulder weighing 500 to 600 kilograms with a single punch was already enough to brag about for half a lifetime. The 7-year-old Li Yueming threw a punch. It was enough to easily blow off a boulder weighing 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms. The difference between them was obvious. However, Li Yueming was still not satisfied. Because after a long period of training, he discovered that there were 2 weaknesses below his abdomen. Therefore, in the remaining time, he began to consciously train around the 2 weaknesses in his crotch. The children that Li Yueming bought from the auction house had also grown by a year. Most of the time, his mother and Wang Ermeiza were taking care of the child. Li Yueming would only take the time to give them lessons when he was free. After the children experienced the initial discomfort, he quickly adapted to the life in the courtyard. It was the same. The children all behaved very sensibly. After experiencing that dark life as a prisoner, their minds were far more mature than children of the same age. He watched as Li Yueming squatted in the yard. The group of children stood at the entrance of the courtyard and hesitated for a long time. In the end, Fu Ziro, whose complexion had improved a lot, made up her mind and gritted her teeth. "Brother, we want to practice martial arts with you." Li Yueming stopped his training. He turned around and looked at the dozen children behind him. He didn't refuse or agree. "Why do you want to practice martial arts?" For a moment, the children were stumped by this question. After a long while, they started to think about it. "I want to become a martial artist and kill all the bad guys in the world. I want to kill the officials. Mommy used to say that the officials are all animals. I don't know what I want to do either, but practicing martial arts seems very cool. I like the feeling of coolness." The children spoke freely. Each and every one of their faces revealed a look of longing. However, Li Yueming did not hear the answer he wanted. People often had many choices in their lives. Instead, he chose martial arts. In a world where martial arts were revered, it meant that one held the power of life and death. Li Yueming definitely wouldn't teach these kids martial arts knowledge at will. After all the children had answered, Li Yueming looked at Fu Xiaoro, who didn't say anything. Fu Xiaoro took a deep breath and said, "I also want to be a strong person who can protect others like my brother. If that's the case, come to my courtyard tomorrow at 5:30 a.m. Li Yueming nodded. The other children looked at each other when they heard this. "Let me look at you." Their faces were filled with confusion and confusion. Looking at the child in front of him, Li Yueming sighed, "You still have a long way to go in the future. You shouldn't be blinded by hatred and slaughter. Come and find me when you've figured out the meaning of your existence." It was laughable. Li Yueming had never learned any martial arts knowledge from this world. He was still at the lowest level of the martial apprentice realm. However, with his two top-notch talents, infinite deduction and martial Dao supremacy. However, he had forcefully touched the threshold of a high-level martial artist. It had to be said that it was simply too exaggerated. The river of time flowed slowly. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. Li Yueming was 8 years old. More and more children followed him to practice martial arts. They were still young. Although the seeds of hatred were beginning to show. But there was still time to correct it. After his cheap mother's meticulous care and Li Yueming's words and examples, he was able to understand the situation. The children finally adjusted their attitudes. As for Li Yueming himself, after a year of continuous polishing, the last weakness was finally made up for. One day, heavy snow fell from the sky above King Duport. Under the service of Wang Ermeize, he put on his clothes. He looked up at the dancing snow and said, "What time is it today?" Wang Ermeize looked at Li Yueming, who was no different from an ordinary child. The shock in his heart was indescribable. He had personally witnessed Li Yueming transform from an 8-year-old boy into a muscular man with arms that could run a horse. Then, he went from being a muscular man to being harmless. What exactly happened? Wang Ermeize didn't even dare to think too deeply. Hearing Li Yueming's question, Wang Ermeize did not dare to hide anything and said, "Young master, today is already the winter solstice. Does it snow in Qingdu Harbor in winter?" Li Yueming asked. Wang Ermeize shook his head. "Young master, Qingdu Port is a coastal city. It rarely snows in the past. Even if there are sporadic snowflakes, they are definitely not this heavy." Hearing his answer, Li Yueming understood. After a long silence, he suddenly said, "Change your clothes and go out with me." Wang Ermeize's eyes widened. For a moment, he could not believe his ears. Ever since he moved into this courtyard, Li Yueming had not stepped out of the courtyard for 2 years. He was the one who usually purchased all kinds of materials. Young master actually took the initiative to say that he wanted to go out. After confirming that he had not misheard, Wang Ermeize's first reaction was that the sky of Qingdu Portal was going to change. Sob, 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 sob. Seeking tips, monthly votes, recommendation votes. Failed authors were counting on this data to motivate themselves to write. Chapter 62, after 2 years, he had swept through everything once again, _L. 2 years ago. The 6-year-old Li Ming could kill the famous Iron Fist Brotherhood in King Duport with his own strength. After 2 years of hard work, Li Yueming had grown more than 10 centimeters taller. His physique had also increased exponentially. Wang Ermeize couldn't even imagine it. If Li Yueming were to make a move now, it would cause a huge commotion. He changed into a set of thicker clothes. Facing the falling snow. After 2 years, Li Yueming finally walked out of the courtyard. King Duport hadn't changed much. The only difference was that there were more Westerners on the streets. In the past, there would be at most 1 or 2 foreigners on the streets. Now, it had expanded to 3 or 4 out of 10 people. The Western European preachers held the Bible in their hands and went from door to preach the doctrine. The Free State's Gokyudo Grandmasters of Combat were all burly, each of them holding a piece of paper that looked like a flyer, selling his ultimate combat training everywhere. The foreigners were generally stronger than the native Xia people. They walked on the road like gorillas with bulging muscles. Therefore, it was very eye-catching. He smelled something unusual. However, all of this had nothing to do with him for the time being. Stepping on the muddy snow, Li Yueming arrived at the starting point of his trip. The Lingyuan Martial Arts School, known as one of the 8 great martial arts schools in King Duport. Behind him was the Lingyuan sect, a second-rate sect in Lingnan. Since Li Yueming came to visit with such fanfare, it was naturally impossible for him to go for tea. The dojo was practicing boxing. Li Yueming barged in and kicked the signboard of the Lingyuan Martial Arts Dojo under the shocked gazes of the disciples. He said coldly, "Challenge the dojo. If you don't want to die, get lost. If you want to die, get over here." As soon as he said this, suddenly, a thunderclap exploded like a clear sky. All the disciples of Lingyuan Martial Arts School were shocked. When he saw that Li Yueming was just a child who hadn't even grown his hair yet, he was shocked. They couldn't help but laugh out loud. "Where did this little brat come from? Have you weaned? Do you know what this place is? You want to challenge me? I can't take it anymore. I'm dying of laughter." Almost all the disciples in the dojo burst into laughter. Only a few disciples felt that Li Yueming looked familiar. However, the last time Li Yueming appeared in King Duport was 2 years ago. No matter how familiar they were. At this moment, she couldn't recognize that this child was the terrifying demon king who had shocked the entire King Duport 2 years ago. Facing their ridicule, Li Yueming didn't say any more nonsense. He directly kicked a fatty who weighed more than 200 pounds in the air. Fatty didn't even know when Li Yueming made his move. He only saw a blur. His entire body fell to the ground, and he could only twitch instinctively. He looked at the fat man whose limbs were twisted on the ground. Countless disciples felt their scalps explode. It only lasted for a moment. The entire Lingyuan dojo could be heard as a pin dropped. Even the sound of breathing had temporarily disappeared. "Hurry up. It was too fast." As a result, almost no one saw what Li Yueming did. He could only stare blankly at Fatty, who was twitching all over the ground. After his brain was turned off, he could not turn it back on for a long time. The 3 views of countless martial artists were shattered along with the Fatty's twisted body in front of them. Sometimes, the difference between humans was even greater than that between humans and pigs. He looked at the stunned crowd in front of him. "If you don't want to die, get lost," Li Yueming said again. All the disciples of the dojo came to their senses. They began to flee in all directions. They paid for their classes and did not have much sense of belonging to the dojo. Therefore, he naturally had no pressure when he ran. Only an old man with white hair sat on the platform not far away. Li Yueming walked over and said, "Hand over all the martial arts manuals of your dojo and I can spare your life." The old man stood up. "Don't be too arrogant, young man. Today, I'll let you know the fundamental difference between a martial apprentice and a martial master. She stood there silently and looked at him. The old man waved his arm in the air. A strong and fierce airflow rushed out from his abdomen. It actually produced an extremely powerful fist force. The old man circulated his chi for a week. He suddenly jumped up and circulated all the energy in his body as he shouted, lightning 5 successive whip. He watched as the old man's aura rose to its peak step by step, until the back leg was about to hit his head. Only then did he make his move. A sudden kick came from behind. He directly kicked the old man more than 20 meters away. The old man fell to the ground with his eyes wide open. Her eyes were filled with an expression as if she had seen a ghost. One had to know that he was a martial master. Although he was only an ordinary mid-level martial master, he possessed Qi Jin, so his combat power was not something that a martial apprentice could touch. But this child in front of him. He didn't feel a trace of energy on his body. He was clearly just a martial apprentice. But if that was the case, why was he sent flying by a martial apprentice? Of course, Li Yueming was not in the mood to explain. The old man was speechless. His entire body was numb. The 3 views that he had cultivated for more than 80 years exploded like the group of disciples who had seen Li Yueming kick Fatty to death. After visiting the Lingyun martial arts dojo, Li Yueming instructed Wang Ermeza to follow behind him in order to collect the secret manuals. He didn't delay at all. Without stopping, he set off for the next dojo. After all, these dojos were all well informed. If he didn't hurry up, the other dojos got wind of it. Perhaps when the time came, he would only be able to miss. He had to ensure that he could destroy everything at the fastest speed possible. Hence, on this day, a magnitude 12 earthquake shook the entire Qingdu harbor. After 2 years, like a bolt of lightning, Li Yueming raided the 8 most famous dojos in Qingdu harbor, and swept it from top to bottom. The thousands of martial arts dojo disciples on the streets of Qingdu port were fleeing frantically like stray dogs. As they fled in defeat, Li Yueming's shocking feat of destroying 8 martial arts centers in one day was also widely spread. Even though the residents of Qingdu port were extremely brawny, when he heard the news, he could not help but slap himself twice. All 8 martial arts centers were flattened in one day. Who had the guts to do this? One must know that the 8 great dojos might not be that scary. However, the 8 great sects behind it were the true behemoths. After such an explosive killing spree, do you really want to die? Chapter 63, Creating a Method. It took half a day. Li Yueming swept through the 8 most famous dojos in Qingdu port at lightning speed. After emptying all the martial arts manuals stored in the dojo, he swaggered out of the dojo as if nothing had happened. He did not attract anyone's attention along the way. After all, no one would think that a gentle and quiet youth like him was the cause of this storm. Such terrifying efficiency. Such astonishing courage and combat strength. Countless martial artists in the entire Qingdu port had lost their confidence. One had to know that there were 8 dojos here. Even a martial arts grandmaster would need some time to challenge one by one, right? This peerless fierce man who had suddenly appeared in Qingdu port had actually taken less than half a day to clean them up. It was simply an oath that he would not stop until the heavens were pierced through. The port and even the nearby cities were affected. All the major factions felt uneasy. They frantically sent their intelligence agencies to search for the scattered disciples to gather information. When they found out that it was an underage child who caused all this, they were shocked. An even more intense tremor erupted. I heard that the one who swept through the 8 dojos this time is a child who hasn't even reached adulthood yet. F***ck, is that true? Of course it's true. All the disciples who escaped said the same thing. Are children so powerful these days? Is there a possibility that he is a disciple of a top hidden sect? That should be the only reason. I didn't expect such a big flood dragon to come to a small place like Kingdeport. The martial artists in the cities around Kingdeport were all discussing. Many ordinary people had even heard some rumors. After a heated discussion, the martial artists around Kingdeport fell into a strange silence again. The 8 great martial dojos were quite famous in Clear Spring County. However, it was not worth mentioning in Lingnan. Don't forget. Behind the 8 dojos stood a few of the most famous second-rate sects in Lingnan. The sect recruited disciples from middle-class families through the dojo to earn money. Every 2 years, some or tne more outstanding disciples would deselectia to replenish their blood. The disciple assessment was going to be held in 2 months. In the end, the dojo was destroyed on the day when the leeks were ripe. How could these sects sit idly by? The martial artists near Kingdeport were curious about what the sects would do after receiving the news. However, transportation was inconvenient these days. Even the dojo relied on carriages to send messages back and forth. It would take at least half a month for the news of the 8 dojos being destroyed to reach the ears of the other sects in Lingnan. At this moment, everyone was waiting for the show to begin. In response to this, a storm raged in Kingdeport. Li Yueming didn't care too much. In fact, his biggest goal for going out this time was to collect martial arts secret manuals. After all, he had already reached the peak of the martial apprentice realm. Every inch of his muscles and skin had been polished to the extreme. There was no longer a single break. Advancing to a higher level martial master had become Li Yueming's most important goal. However, due to the lack of specific information for reference, even if Li Yueming had 2 super talents, infinite deduction and martial Dao Supreme, the progress of advancing to martial master through self-study was also extremely slow. After trying a few times, he realized that it was a thankless task. Only then did Li Yueming start to pay attention to the dojos. He looked at the 8 martial arts inner force books neatly placed in front of him. Li Yueming flipped through it. The first book was the Lingyun Internal Strength of the Lingyun Martial Arts School. There was only the content of the Martial Master Scroll. After all, the Lingyun Martial Dojo was only an inconspicuous secular force under the Lingyun sect. The most valuable thing in the entire library was probably this incomplete internal strength manual. However, this was enough for Li Yueming. He finished reading this remnant scroll. Li Yueming closed his eyes and pondered for a moment. According to the description of the internal energy, he used his infinite deduction talent to simulate it in his mind. The Lingyun sect's cultivation technique emphasized on elegance. After the inner chi was condensed, one could fly and walk on walls, possessing extremely high flexibility. However, some of the moves that came with it were relatively ordinary. Its attack power was very limited. One of them was the lightning whip that the old man from the dojo had used on him. Ryuosu. Li Yueming quickly shook his head and complained, "What the hell? Trash that even dogs don't learn." He threw the inner force of the Lingyun sect, which was regarded as a treasure, to the side like trash. Li Yueming picked up the Blue Cloud sect's Blue Cloud Chi internal skill. The Blue Cloud sect was considered one of the stronger sects among the many second-rate sections. It was rumored that the founding ancestor of the Blue Cloud sect had once worked as a servant for 2.5 years in the Primordial Chaos Limitless sect, one of the 5 top sects of the Great Xia Kingdom. This inner chi cultivation method was something he had learned while doing odd jobs in the Primordial Chaos Limitless sect. Li Yueming glanced at it and found it interesting. The greatest feature of this technique was that it could continuously nourish the inner chi in the body through the meridians. During battle, he could transform his inner chi into a skillful force, thereby achieving the effect of using a few taels of silver to deflect 1,000 pounds. When necessary, he could even release all of his inner chi. A surprise attack could often catch the opponent off guard. He closed his eyes and deduced for a while. In the end, he opened his eyes and smiled. He casually put down the Qingyun sect's internal energy. Li Yueming continued to flip through the cultivation techniques of the remaining 6 sections. Half a month passed in the blink of an eye. Li Yueming would meditate with his eyes closed every day. He would not eat or drink for a period of time or even days and nights. Every day, he sat there. This caused his mother to worry. Fortunately, Li Yueming looked normal and didn't look weak. Only then did Wang Ermeizi persuade her not to go in and disturb him. Li Yueming woke up from his slumber. Whether it was the Qingyun sex cultivation technique or the Lingyun sex cultivation technique, Li Yueming didn't even care. Of course, he didn't plan to learn it in the first place. The reason why he studied it day and night was because he wanted to absorb its strengths. He wanted to create his own method. Moreover, the creation of the technique was not ordinary. It was a technique that belonged to him alone. In the previous world, Li Yueming had explored the star-moon breathing technique through his infinite deduction talent. He needed to build a higher level of cultivation technique on the foundation of this technique. Moreover, he had to go against the heavens and could not follow the martial Dao rules of this world. After all, Li Yueming's true identity was still a reincarnator. In the future, the laws of the reincarnation worlds he went to would be different from this martial Dao world. If the star-moon breathing technique followed the rules of this martial Dao world, then the star-moon breathing technique would be able to be used. Then he might be able to easily defeat everyone in this world. However, once he left the martial Dao rules of this world, when I go to the next strange world, I get numb again. In some technological worlds, martial artists and martial arts did not exist at all. If he did not want to develop technology according to the rules of the world, he would have to figure out the cultivation method himself from beginning to end. And to explore the individual's power in this kind of technological law, the difficulty was no different from looking for a masochist. There were also some strange worlds filled with virtual creatures without physical bodies. If they did not have any trump cards, ordinary reincarnators were not even worth mentioning in front of such monsters. Only by creating a method that did not rely on the rules of any world would Li Yueming not fail in the future reincarnation process due to the conflict of rules with the world. Of course, if he wanted to achieve the goal of not relying on the laws of any world, he would need a long time to accumulate in the various reincarnation worlds. What Li Yueming needed to do now was to build this framework and improve it step by step. Similarly, this was also a sign that a new reincarnator was maturing. During the reincarnation process, the reincarnators would choose the corresponding development system according to their interests, hobbies, and specialties. Some people chose to develop technology. How to quickly develop various technologies in the world of various laws was the great Dao that these reincarnators tirelessly pursued. There were also people who chose to cultivate their souls. How to strengthen and increase their soul abilities in each world was a research topic that they needed to persevere in. But now, Li Yueming chose to focus on his personal strength. From this, it could be seen how important the star-moon breathing technique was to him. If the other reincarnators knew that he had just entered 2 reincarnation worlds and was already delusional about creating a technique, they would probably laugh their heads off. He wanted to create a powerful cultivation technique that was incompatible with the laws of the world. Among the reincarnators, it was something that only the big shots above level 5 could consider. Daily tips, monthly votes, recommendation votes. Chapter 64, Dog Bite Dog, 1. Li Ming named the new technique the Star Moon Mantra. He took a few lousy cultivation techniques from the 8 great dojos and deduced them for half a month without sleeping or resting. Li Yueming received a message that he rarely used. These 8 cultivation techniques were simply too weak. Deduction came and went. Only the Qingyun sex cultivation method gave him some gains. Most of the time, the other cultivation techniques could only be refined into a pile of useless trash. Other than that, Li Yueming had also gained something. After he finished studying the few inner qi techniques of the martial master realm, he did not even need to cultivate. The bottleneck between martial apprentice and martial master instantly disappeared. In fact, Li Yueming had already met the requirements to become a martial master. However, all these years, he had not paid attention to it. Instead, he had been constantly suppressing his body. Moreover, he did not know how to guide the birth of inner qi. That was why he had never been promoted. When he saw the cultivation method of a martial master, he was shocked. He did not even need to guide the aura in his body as it gushed out impatiently. This was the so-called accumulation. And because he had been oppressed all year round. The force in Li Yueming's body had just been born, and it was already exceptionally strong. An 8-year-old martial master. In the entire central plains of China, it should be a rare existence. And Li Yueming's foundation was still so solid. He had just advanced to martial master, but his strength was already unfathomable. An ordinary no-name martial master probably wouldn't even be able to defeat him if he strengthened them. He could feel the surging inner qi in his body. Li Yueming was also in a good mood. The most important thing for him was to collect more high-level martial arts techniques. He removed the dregs and extracted the essence, adding it to the Star Moon technique. It provided nutrients for the growth of the Star Moon sect. Li Yueming didn't continue meditating. Currently, the martial arts techniques of the 8 great dojos had already been squeezed dry by him. There was no point in continuing to deduce here. He opened the courtyard door. The entire world was covered in silver. His mother was clearing the snow for the vegetables in the yard. Because there was nothing to do. His mother, who couldn't be idle, raised a lot of chickens and ducks in the side courtyard. The empty space at the side of the courtyard was also left, and all kinds of vegetables were planted. Every once in a while, he would slaughter a few chickens and ducks and grow his own vegetables to nourish the children's bodies. However, this heavy snow seemed to have come at a very bad time. Half of the vegetables that his mother had reared in the courtyard had just sprouted and were already frozen to death. They were trying their best to save the remaining cold-resistant species. Li Yueming also walked over. "Mom, let me help you." When his mother saw him, she was stunned at first, then she pulled him by the sleeve and brought him to the warm main house. After sizing Li Yueming up and down, he said, You haven't eaten or drunk for the past half a month. Did you hurt your body?" "It's not until later that I realized it." Li Yueming rubbed his belly. Then, he scratched his head in embarrassment and said, "I really seem to be a little hungry." His cheap mother rolled her eyes at him angrily. She turned around and happily went to the side courtyard to kill chickens and make soup. The child was getting stronger and stronger. As a mother, the help she could provide was getting smaller and smaller. Although logically speaking, this was a good thing. But as a mother, what she missed the most was the time when the mother and son depended on each other. Life was hard. However, golden flowers were shining everywhere. Looking at the woman's departing figure, Li Yueming also felt complicated. His cheap mother was destined to be a passerby in his life. But to his mother, he had been a mischievous child since she was young. Therefore, sometimes, the loneliness of a reincarnator. There was no cure. Outside the courtyard, the young boys are sweating in the cold wind. He was Li Yueming's first batch of disciples. Li Yueming was very strict with them. Basically, every day, they would train to the limits of their bodies and willpower. However, after slowly getting through it, he had already adapted to this kind of life. 2 years of training. Many of them had lost their childlike innocence. It became much more mature and thick. This was only on the surface. In fact, this group of children was still very innocent. Their cheap mother was now their second mother. Under her gentle treatment, many of the shadows of the children's childhood had disappeared. Excitement appeared on the children's faces. Master Yueming. This was what Wang Ermeiza told them to call him. The children had always addressed Li Yueming with this title. His gaze swept across them. It landed on Fu Xiro's body. Li Yueming had always thought that Fu Xiro was the destined child of this era. However, what happened later was beyond his expectations. Fu Xiro's talent in martial arts was very average. It could even be described as poor. Among the dozen children, she had always been at the bottom. This made Li Yueming doubt his life, not knowing what went wrong. It was not that there were no powerful disciples among this group of disciples. One of them, Han Bufan, was very talented. After 2 years of training, Han Bufan, who was only 10 years old, had already become a high-level martial apprentice. If Li Yueming wanted to, he only needed to tell him the cultivation method of a martial master now. Han Bufan would probably be able to break through to martial master in a few months. Such talent. He was definitely 1 in 10,000 among ordinary people. In the next hour, Li Yueming checked the progress of his disciples. He also gave a few words of encouragement. Then, she went back to her room to eat something to fill her stomach. Wang Ermeize, who had gone out to scout for news, had just returned home. Li Yueming had already come out of the training room. Wang Ermeize's eyes lit up. "Young master, it's a mess outside," she said in a panic. Li Yueming glanced at him and had a guess in his heart. "What's wrong?" he asked. "The people from the 8 great sects came down the mountain to find trouble with me." Wang Ermeize shook his head, but nodded after a while. She opened her mouth a few times, but she didn't know what to say. After a long time of thinking, Wang Ermeize then said word by word, "The 8 great sects have indeed sent people, but they didn't find trouble with you. Instead, they went to find trouble with those foreigners." Li Yueming looked confused. Wang Ermeize's expression was a little strange, but he still braced himself and said, "After some investigation, the 8 great sects believe that it's impossible for a child like you to wipe out all 8 martial arts centers at once, so they suspect that it's the work of those foreigners. This is a rather bizarre affair." Even if Wang Ermeize had seen it with his own eyes, he would find it hard to believe that it had really happened. Li Yueming's expression turned strange. These 8 great sects were truly innocent. However, when he thought about it carefully from the other party's point of view, it seemed that it was a little reasonable. Wang Ermeize sorted out his thoughts and continued, "The conflict between the Westerners and the 8 great sects has not been a day or two. Although they often fought in the dark in the past, they were still harmonious on the surface, but this time, the 8 great sects were really serious. Led by a martial king elder, along with over 20 Grand Master elders and over 50 elite disciples. Such a large group of people. They've already gone to cause trouble for the foreign devils from the Free State and Western Europe in an aggressive manner early in the morning." Li Yueming was even more speechless. What should be said or not? Although he had found the wrong target for revenge. However, at least the 8 great sects had a tight grasp on their prestige and aura. Moreover, he had even sent out a martial king realm elder. It seemed like he was serious this time. However, since they didn't find him, Li Yueming naturally wouldn't jump out and get beaten up for nothing. A dog biting a dog. When both sides were injured, he would go and harvest a wave of green chives. This was in line with Sixth Brother's way. In addition, thank you for the tips. Chapter 65, The Decline of Martial Arts, The Arrival of Chaos, 1. According to the original fate. At the age of 12, Free State's Gokyudo pugilist and Western Europe's Sacred Fire missionary landed at Qingdu. They also had a fierce conflict with the local forces of China. After Li Yueming's barrage of punches, the time when this conflict erupted seemed to have been forcefully brought forward. The 8 great sects were unhappy that Gokyudo Grand Masters of combat and preachers had encroached on their resources. He immediately sent a martial king elder, more than 20 Grand Master elders, and a number of elite disciples down the mountain. They charged towards the headquarters of the Free State's pugilist and Western Europe's preachers in Qingdu Harbor. A fierce battle between the traditional sects of Huaxia martial artists and the foreign forces would erupt. However, the reality was beyond everyone's expectations. The elites of the 8 great sects charged at the Western headquarters. Everyone in Qingdu port had yet to recover from the pressure brought by the tyrannical martial artists. The heads of the experts of the 8 great sects were hung on the city gates of Qingdu port. It was said that within half an hour of the elders rushing in, they were carried out horizontally by the disciples of the combat hall. At this moment, looking from afar, the heads on the city gates were still dripping with blood, looking extremely terrifying. As soon as this information spread, the entire Qingdu port was in an uproar. Tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of residents of Qingdu port put down their work. They all swarmed onto the streets. Very soon, the entire entrance of the green capital harbor was surrounded by the surging stream of people. Looking at the 8 great sects elders who were still incomparably ferocious during the day, countless martial artists were terrified. A foreigner who was more than 2 meters tall and covered in strong muscles stood at the city gate. He spoke in Chinese that wasn't very fluent. "Ls this the expert among the Chinese martial artists?" Dozens of people rushed over, but they were killed by the dozens of guards of our Gokyudo combat dojo. If that's all you have, then your ancient Chinese martial arts are just so-so. His combat power is less than 10 times that of our Free State's Gokyudo fighting technique. The Westerners stood on the high city walls. He looked down at all the Chinese people in Qingdu port. The disdain and contempt on his face was like a naked steel knife. It made many people's livers hurt. However, looking at the heads hanging on the city wall, he could not help but sigh. Everyone had to admit, this time, China's martial arts seemed to have really suffered a huge setback. As a result, countless martial artists could not help but have strong self-doubt in their hearts. Were these foreigners and their Gokyudo fighting techniques really that powerful? Li Yueming and Wang Ermeiza were also in the crowd. He looked at the head hanging on the city gate. This didn't follow common sense. He was still thinking that the martial artists of the 8 great sects and the Grand Masters of Combat of the Free State would suffer heavy losses. Then, he could take advantage of it. He hadn't even finished his lunch in the courtyard. The heads of the elders and disciples of the 8 great sects were hung on the city wall. Li Yueming could smell something unusual from this quick battle record. Logically speaking, China's Central Plains, Free State, and Western Europe should be the 3 pillars of power. The Free State and Western Europe were developing rapidly. Only the Central Plains of Huaxia was stuck in a cycle of self-restraint in both martial arts and politics. Then, he thought of Fu Xiaoro, who had no talent in martial arts. In the dark, Li Yueming felt as if he had touched a trace of the will of heaven and earth. However, this was not a good thing for him. After all the elders and disciples of the 8 great sects had been wiped out, they would not be able to do anything. The entire Qingdu port was in discussion for a long time. Everyone thought that the 8 great sects wouldn't take this lying down. However, half a year passed in the blink of an eye. The 8 great sects didn't send any news either and fell silent. They fell silent. It further fueled the arrogance of the foreigners. The Westerners, who were originally quite well behaved, began to gradually become unscrupulous. Countless warriors were mocked. He was chased away. Of course, it wasn't that there was no one to resist. However, most of those who resisted would only die. The foreigners were rampant. However, their ultimate fighting techniques were extremely powerful. Even if an ordinary person practiced for 2 to 3 years, it was also more powerful than many Huaxia martial artists who had been practicing for more than 10 years. As time passed, as long as they saw the foreigners, the warriors around the Qingdu port did not even dare to raise their heads. The entire Qingdu port had become the foreigners' backyard. The Free State's Gokyudo combat gym and Western Europe's churches popped up like bamboo shoots after a rain. It filled the market gap left behind by the destruction of the 8 martial arts schools. Many small and medium-sized families in Kingdeport were also willing to send their children to the Gokyudo fighting gym to be trained when they saw Gokyudo fighting techniques beating up martial artists. During this process, Li Yueming had also secretly investigated the so-called Gokyudo fighting technique. Other than the fact that his moves were sharper and more powerful, there was no fundamental difference between Gokyudo fighting techniques and martial artists' body tempering. The only difference was that the Westerners had a set of machines that specialized in measuring human body functions. He could check his body's condition at regular intervals. Then, he would use this opportunity to adjust the disciples' training courses. This was the same principle as Li Yueming using infinite deduction to train every inch of his body. The only difference was that Li Yueming could polish every inch of his body to perfection through infinite deduction. And the machines of the foreigners could only be polished to a so-so level. However, even if that was all, it was also enough to widen the gap between Gokyudo grandmasters of combat and ordinary martial artists. No wonder the 8 great sects suffered such a huge loss. After finding the source of the Gokyudo grandmaster of combat's power, he was able to find a way out. Li Yueming also studied the sacred flame preachers in Western Europe. He realized that this group of mysterious priests actually had some skills. You can obtain energy by praying to the gods. The combat strength of a devout person was even more terrifying than a Gokyudo grandmaster of combat. This naturally attracted Li Yueming's attention. In order to study the methods of the preachers, he had even joined the church to study for a period of time. In the beginning, he found nothing. Only later did he discover the clues. It turned out that the missionaries' scriptures contained a strange rhythm. With this rhythm, he could mobilize his body and fuse with the energy of heaven and earth. The deeper the understanding of the scriptures, the more terrifying the power that a preacher could unleash. This discovery surprised Li Yueming. In the martial arts system of China's Zhejiang province, in order to communicate with the world, one had to reach the martial saint realm. In the entire Central Plains of China, the number of martial saints who were still alive was definitely not more than 1 palm. However, the missionary could actually touch the power of the martial saint realm through the comprehension and chanting of scriptures. After learning to achieve success, Li Yueming began to meditate in the latter half of the year. He was frantically deducing the secrets hidden in the preacher's scriptures. It took a lot of effort. He finally had a good harvest. Not only did it add a brand new touch to the star moon technique, it also allowed his personal strength to rise by a level. It would scare people to death if he said it. Right now, Li Yueming was only a small martial master. However, he had relied on the scriptures and deduction to forcefully comprehend the power of heaven and earth that only a martial saint could control. Even though it was insignificant compared to a true martial saint. However, if word got out, it was estimated that the entire Central Plains of China would be shaken 3 times. An extremely fulfilling year quietly passed. Li Yueming was a 9-year-old. One day, after he finished meditating, Li Yueming saw Wang Ermeiza looking around at the door with a panicked expression. Seeing that he had woken up, Wang Ermeiza hurriedly walked in and said, "Young master, the emperor of the Great Xia Empire suddenly died half a month ago. The new emperor did not succeed the throne smoothly. The world is about to fall into chaos." Li Yueming slowly stood up from the futon. He looked at his cheap mother's barren vegetable field outside the door. He suddenly remembered a sentence he often read in history books. There was a great famine and cannibalism. The city walls were empty, and bones covered the wilderness. Chapter 66, The First Blade in Chaotic Times. He looked at Li Yueming with a complicated expression. "Young master, what's wrong?" Wang Ermeiza asked in confusion. He sighed. "Let's go out and take a look." Wang Ermeiza did as he was told. The two arrived at Green Harbor. Compared to the liveliness and prosperity a year ago, this time, Li Yueming could clearly feel that there were fewer people and goods in Qingduport. The palace was in chaos. The already unstable places became even more chaotic. In the past, the bandits were somewhat afraid of the government's troops. All the county governors were scheming in their hearts. How could he control them? In addition, the temperature this year was much lower than in previous years. The crops planted in the fields could not grow normally because of the low temperature. It was going to be another disastrous year. The bandits from all over the world had already formed a mighty crowd. Raging, killing, looting, and attacking the village were just the appetizers. Many powerful bandits even dared to attack cities. The trade route could not be maintained. Naturally, there were fewer merchants coming and going to Qingduport. However, this cold wave that was visible to the naked eye did not hit the Westerners. They were dressed in suits and high heels as they walked down the street. They were completely different from the surrounding civilians in ragged clothes. Standing beside the most prosperous alley in the past, Li Yueming saw many refugees with yellow faces. Some of them were begging on the streets, while others were gritting their teeth and looking for a job. However, in this bleak environment, no one had the strength to be a saint. Those who had surplus food at home might give them a few steamed buns. But that was all. This was only a small part of the scene under the turmoil. According to Wang Ermeze, the refugees who were able to enter Qingduport were already the luckiest batch. The scene outside the city gate was truly tragic. The number of refugees increased every day, and the number of people who froze to death and starved to death also soared. The city should be able to accommodate some refugees, right? Li Yueming asked in a muffled voice. I heard that it's the peak season for fish harvest recently. Hearing his question, Wang Ermeze glanced around. After making sure that there were no other spies around. The Westerners won't let us go. They are the true rulers of the city, he whispered. Li Yueming finally understood. The world was in chaos and the warlords were divided. It was actually a good opportunity for him. After all, if he wanted to obtain a higher score for the reincarnation mark, he would have to do something earth-shattering in this world. The chaotic world was a piece of soil that was full of nutrients. The first strike would be from these foreign devils in Qingduport. In the courtyard, the youths trained hard day after day. However, Li Yueming had already allowed them to move around outside. The children were not bored. He looked at the group of disciples in front of him who were full of fighting spirit. Li Yueming opened his mouth and said, "Put on your clothes and grab your weapons. Follow me." The students were all pleasantly surprised when they heard this. Li Yueming had never brought them out before. Today was the first time. He quickly packed his things. The group of people walked out of the old courtyard. He silently followed behind Li Yueming and headed toward the Free State's Gokyudo dojo. Many martial artists noticed Li Yueming's group. They couldn't help but stop and look over. Li Yueming and his disciple were too eye-catching. They were like dazzling pearls in the crowd. It was difficult not to attract attention. Many martial artists followed behind them out of curiosity. There were also some sharp people who noticed that Li Yueming and the others seemed to be heading towards the Free State's Gokyudo Combat Dojo headquarters. This discovery could not help but arouse the bewilderment of many martial artists. In just a year, the Westerners used their absolute combat strength and superiority to suppress all the martial artists in Qingduport. The status of martial artists in Qingduport was only slightly better than that of ordinary civilians. If they met foreigners, they could only lower their heads and wag their tails if they wanted to live. The group of young men in front of him rushed towards the Gokyudo Combat Dojo's headquarters aggressively. Could it be that he was looking for trouble with the foreigners? Li Yueming and the others were getting closer and closer to the combat hall headquarters. Finally, a martial artist caught up and whispered, "What are you kids trying to do? The foreigners over there don't even blink when they kill our Chinese martial artists." Hearing the reminder, Li Yueming turned around and looked at the warrior. He could not help but reveal a harmless smile and said seriously, "To tell you the truth, I don't like to blink when I kill people either." The martial artist was speechless. The little ghosts these days really did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Good words can't persuade a damn ghost. It was a pity that they were just a bunch of kids whose hair had not fully grown. The martial artist sighed and took a few steps back. He followed from afar, afraid that he would be implicated if something happened later. It wasn't that they were too cowardly. It was because the spines of the martial artists around Kingdeport had been broken by the Westerners. It wasn't like there weren't any people who had challenged those foreigners in the past. But what was the final result? If they weren't beheaded, they would be teased to death by those damn Westerners. All of them ended up miserable. 30 minutes later, Li Yueming led the 16 disciples to the Gokyudo Combat Dojo's headquarters. This was a building that occupied a huge area. It was different from the dilapidated wooden houses around it. The Gokyudo combat tubes were decorated in a very imposing manner. There was also a statue of a strong and exquisite man at the door. It was said that this half-naked fellow was the god of combat of the Free State. His status in the Free State was barely equivalent to the founding ancestor of the Great Xia Kingdom. He was the one who had developed Gokyudo fighting techniques to the extreme. Furthermore, he had single-handedly promoted it to the entire Free State. The Great Xia Kingdom's ancestor had died on the path of seeking immortality and seeking Dao hundreds of years ago. And this Gokyudo god of combat was still in his prime. The members of the combat hall were all undergoing physical training. Generally speaking, Chinese people were not allowed to enter the headquarters of the Gokyudo fighting gym. They could only pay to learn Gokyudo fighting techniques in the branch. Therefore, there were only foreigners here. Just like 3 years ago, Li Yueming kicked away the statue that symbolized the Gokyudo god of combat. He said coldly, "Challenge the dojo. If you don't want to die, get lost. If you want to die, get over here." Countless muscular men rushed out of the Gokyudo combat gym. He looked at the broken statue of the god of combat. All the Westerners were spitting out anger from their eyes. "Despicable Huaxia native, how dare you trample on the god of combat with your dirty feet? I'm going to hang you up and stab you in the ass." Li Yueming, concealment. This group of foreign gus had a strong taste. The foreigners from the Gokyudo fighting gym were furious. He suddenly rushed over. Obviously, he was prepared to tear the rebellious Li Yueming into pieces. Li Yueming did not make a move. The 16 disciples behind him stood out. The strongest eldest senior brother, Han Bufan, shouted and took the lead to attack. "Anyone who blocks my master will die." He finished speaking. The young man punched out with one hand. A punch pierced through the chest of the Westerner who was charging at the front. Blood splattered on his face. Han Bufan's expression was still determined and cold. It could only be said that they were indeed of the same lineage. Han Bufan did not like to blink his eyes when killing people. The other disciples did not want to be outdone. One after another, they violently attacked. In front of them, the arrogant Westerners were as miserable as dead dogs. His internal organs flew everywhere. Outside the door, countless martial artists who had come to watch the show saw the scene and could not help but open their mouths wide. He could not close it for a long time. At the same time, a wave of excitement and tremors surged out from the depths of their souls. It turned into a warm current that sparkled in the eyes of all the martial artists. Someone couldn't help but rub his eyes repeatedly and mutter, Is this really the power that we martial artists can display? I won't refuse any recommendation or monthly votes." Chapter 67, Exposed as the Devil Li Yueming? 1. The Westerners in the Gokyudo dojo headquarters fell like wheat being harvested. It wasn't as if there weren't a few ruthless characters who wanted to ambush them from the crowd. However, they were all killed by Li Yueming in one swift, accurate, and ruthless move. 16 disciples. Although he hadn't broken through to become a martial master yet, he couldn't use Qi Jin. However, their actual combat strength had basically reached the martial master realm. This martial master was not a martial master in the eyes of ordinary people. It was the martial master in Li Yueming's eyes. Among them, the strongest was naturally Han Bufan, who was called the eldest senior brother. He was talented to begin with. He was also the most hard-working when he cultivated. During this period of time, his combat strength would improve by a level almost every month. Now, his strength was infinitely close to the peak of the martial master realm. As for the weakest disciple, it was none other than Fu Xiaoro. He did not know what went wrong. Although Fu Xiaoro was also diligent in her cultivation, the results were very mediocre. In addition, she was a woman. His combat strength had always been at the peak of the martial apprentice realm. Fu Xiaoro, who had the weakest combat ability, was also the target of Li Yueming's attention. The 17 of them were extremely ferocious. He did not retreat when he was surrounded by hundreds of Gokyudo fighters. On the contrary, he was pushed forward by more than 10 meters. However, it was different from the last time Li Yueming challenged the dojo, when the martial artists of the 8 great sects scattered in a hubbub. This time, Li Yueming kicked the Gokyudo combat headquarters located in Qingdu. Most of the people who could train here were Gokyudo grandmasters of combat from the Free State. Even though Li Yueming and the others had killed dozens of people, this group of foreigners showed no signs of retreating. However, that was all. Li Yueming easily punched a Tier 3 king of fighters through the head. The remaining hundreds of Westerners immediately began to tremble in fear. A Tier 3 king of combat was equivalent to a peak martial master among Huaxia martial artists. Its combat power could even compare to some weaker martial kings. Even in the entire Gokyudo Fighting Association, he was considered a pillar of existence. However, it was precisely such a powerhouse at the same time. In less than 5 rounds, the cold-blooded youth, who was like a god of death, caught his weakness and punched him in the head. All kinds of juices flew everywhere like broken balloons. It was enough to silence all the fighters present. Although they were all muscular and tall, they did not look particularly smart. However, they were not fools. They all know how to cherish their lives. The combat power that Li Yueming had displayed could easily kill a Tier 3 king of fighters with a single punch. No matter how many of them there were. It would probably be difficult to do anything to the other party. The crowd that had been in a mess just a moment ago could not help but take a few steps back. The group of students realized that the pressure on them had been greatly reduced. He looked up. Only then did they realize that they had already reached the Gokyudo Combat Department's headquarters. Such a high-intensity battle was still too much for this group of teenagers whose average age was no more than 14 or 15 years old. If it wasn't for Li Yueming protecting them all this time, he probably had a narrow escape just now. This did not hinder the excitement in their hearts at all. For all sorts of reasons. The students were already disgusted by this group of hypocritical Westerners. They drank the blood of all the Chinese in Qingdu. However, he looked down on the Chinese. They spread the word that fair skin was the most honorable race, that Gokyudo combat was the most powerful body training technique, and that God created everything in the scriptures. In private, he was doing things that angered the heavens and angered the people. Selling children, seizing land, killing innocent people. This group of noble people in suits and leather shoes were covered in black blood. If it wasn't for the fact that he was lucky enough to be rescued from the cage by Li Yueming. Many years ago, this group of children had already been transported to the Free State as slaves. Some things could be smoothed out with time. However, there were some things that time could not erase. It would also leave a scar in his heart that could not be healed. The youths who had successfully killed their enemies could not help but feel relieved. They finally understood why Li Yueming had brought them here. It turned out that the reason why their teacher went through so much trouble was just to completely remove the scar buried in their hearts. Looking at the incomparably ferocious youths not far away, all the martial artists who followed behind him widened their eyes involuntarily. Every single one of them had muscles all over their bodies, making them look like monsters. Whether it was his physique or his combat methods. This group of Westerners who learned Gokyudo fighting techniques crushed the local martial artists in all aspects. The strong and proud Westerners had once become the nightmare of countless Chinese martial artists. Many martial artists even began to doubt if their genes were really bad. Otherwise, why would he lose to those white-skinned people in all aspects? But now, in front of this group of youngsters, everything seemed to have turned around. Not only did the strong physique of the foreigners not benefit from the young men, but they also had a strong physique. Instead, he was forcefully pressed against the ground. Many Westerners were like watermelons that had been smashed. Blood and flesh splattered everywhere. Many questions popped up in the minds of all the Huaxia martial artists who witnessed this. Who were these youths who had suddenly appeared? And how could they defeat this group of Gokyudo fighters that they once regarded as demons? Was it really the power that martial artists like them could unleash? However, many questions seemed to be destined to be unanswered. A warrior in the crowd looked at Li Yueming's back. Although it was because it had been a long time, his memories were already a little blurry. However, for some reason, the martial artist felt that Li Yueming's back was somewhat familiar. He was stunned for a long time. The warrior finally remembered another figure from a few years ago. Only then did he realize that the two silhouettes in his mind were actually slowly merging. The martial artist's eyes widened. He pointed at Li Yueming and trembled. I know who he is. All the surrounding martial artists who were watching the show quieted down. Their eyes all looked at the martial artist who spoke. Everyone was curious about Li Yueming's identity. An existence with such tyrannical combat strength. Logically speaking, it was impossible for him to be an unknown person. Being stared at by nearly 100 pairs of eyes, the martial artist no longer cared about being afraid. This person seems to be the young man who slaughtered the Iron Fist Brotherhood 3 years ago. The surrounding martial artists gasped. The destruction of the Iron Fist Brotherhood had once caused a great storm. But in the end, it ended because of the youth's disappearance. Many people thought that the young man had already left Kingdeport or died from his injuries. However, he never expected that not only was he alive and kicking. And now, they even went to the headquarters of the Gokyudo Fighting Association in Kingdeport. This was a killing god. This youth was already so terrifying 3 years ago. How ridiculous would his strength be now? Before the group of martial artists could come back to their senses not far away, another martial artist recognized Li Yueming's other identity. It's him, so it's him. Some martial artists couldn't help but retreat as they looked at Li Yueming's back. He finally calmed down. Only then did he say with a trembling voice, he was the young man who kicked the 8 hall masters to death half a year ago. This guy is a devil. Chapter 68, Men just can't leave weaknesses for themselves. 1. Li Yueming had been in Green Harbor for a few years. Every time, the commotion caused was enough to shake the surroundings. However, due to his young age and his low profile after every job, he was able to get a good job. All along, Li Yueming wandered outside the eyes of the major forces. However, this was the 3rd time he had appeared. If the martial artists in Kingdeport still couldn't recognize him, they probably wouldn't be able to survive anymore. *CK, the youth who slaughtered the Iron Fist Brotherhood and the youth who kicked the 8 dojos are the same person. This is simply too terrifying. This youth must be a core disciple of a hidden sect. Could it be that the martial artists of our Kingdeport are about to rise? When he recognized Li Yueming, the group of martial artists started to get excited after being shocked. If he didn't know Li Yueming's identity, They might still have doubts about the final outcome of this battle. Almost all the martial artists felt relieved. Li Yueming's past achievements were too glorious. As a result, many martial artists could still occasionally hear some legends. If he were to personally make a move, perhaps this time, the Westerners would really suffer a huge loss. Under the gazes of countless people around them, it was as if they were looking at a monster. Li Yueming slowly walked forward. The group of Westerners did not dare to stop him. They looked at him with fear and trepidation. This young native warrior was different from the idiot they bullied in the past. They were the toughest of the toughest. The dojo master didn't say anything. No one dared to provoke them, afraid that they would lose their lives if they were not careful. Li Yueming felt as if he had entered an uninhabited realm. He gently kicked open the door of the fighting dojo. The interior of the combat hall was decorated very simply. In the middle of the room was a furnace that was still emitting a fragrance. Beside the furnace, a 2-meter-tall super-strong man was sitting on the floor, resting with his eyes closed. Beside him sat an old man in a black robe holding a book in his hand. Li Yueming knew both of them. The brawny man was the owner of the Gokyudo combat gym in Kingdu Harbor who had mocked the Dragon Country's martial artists for their incompetence on the city tower. As for the black-robed old man, he should be the bishop of the Western Europe's sacred fire priest, Kingdu Port. It could be said. The two men in front of him represented the strongest fighting force among the foreigners in Kingdu Port. When his gaze swept past the black-robed old man, his pupils suddenly constricted. The old man's appearance surprised him. In the end, Li Yueming kicked the door and smashed it into pieces. He walked into the combat hall and said coldly, "You have two choices, either scram or die." Hearing such shameless words, the burly man slowly stood up from the floor and turned to look at Li Yueming. Compared to his 2-meter-tall body, and the muscular arms that could make a horse race, Li Yueming's skinny body was no different from a bean sprout. The head twisted his neck and said, "I'll let you throw 3 punches first. Don't say that our Free State's Gokyudo masters are bullying a native child like you." Even if Li Yueming had just broken through the blockade of the other Gokyudo grandmasters of combat, the head was still disdainful of his strength. Li Yueming was stunned for a moment before he smiled and said, "There's such a good thing." A group of Kingduport martial artists also gathered their courage and approached the combat hall. Seeing this situation, he was not afraid of death anymore. They all warned loudly, "Sir, you must be careful. This foreigner is a rank 5 professional king of combat. He is even more powerful than a high-rank warrior king. I heard that his muscles can even reflect the damage from a fighter. It's very strange." At this moment, in the eyes of all martial artists, Li Yueming no longer represented him alone. Instead, it was a showdown between Huaxia's Zhongzhou martial arts and the Free State's Gokyudo combat. Although the two of them had not reached a particularly high realm yet. However, their strength was the best among the experts of the same level. As a representative, it was enough. He looked at the proud head and said seriously, "That's what you said. Let me punch you 3 times. The head smiled. But before he could say anything sarcastic, however, his vision blurred. In the next second, Li Yueming was already in front of him. He didn't wait for him to be on guard. Li Yueming's fist had already hit his chest. The smile on the head's face froze. Li Yueming looked as if he had just punched out lightly. However, this punch, he felt as if he had been struck in the chest by a giant dragon. He took 5 or 6 steps back. After coughing a few times, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The attack was effective. "It seems that your health isn't too good, sir," Li Yueming said with a smile. "Do you want to take a break and come back?" The director was speechless. He knew that he had failed. His entire face was as black as the bottom of a pot. The young man in front of him looked harmless. In fact, the power contained in his body was simply immeasurable. If he took 3 punches head-on, he would definitely pay a hefty price for this. He could not bring himself to slap himself, so he could only force himself to say, that was just an accident. Again. Hearing this, the smile on Li Yueming's face grew wider. Not bad, you're very energetic, he praised sincerely. Li Yueming had already disappeared from his spot like a ghost. The combat director, who was prepared, blocked Li Yueming's fist with his arm. However, before he could heave a sigh of relief. However, he realized that Li Yueming's fist was just a feint. The actual attack was on his legs. A muffled sound. Li Yueming's knee hit the third leg between the director's legs. He exerted a little force. Everyone heard a painful cracking sound. F***ck this is too fierce. The surrounding martial artists who were watching the battle all widened their eyes. When she came back to her senses, she felt a chill rise from her thighs to the top of her head. There was a kind of pain called looking at it hurts. This was the situation that the director was facing now. Hiss hiss hiss. He had suffered such a huge loss. The director almost fainted. He also let out some unknown cries. If it was an ordinary man, by now, he had probably completely lost his combat strength. However, the director was still a Tier 5 pugilist with an incredibly strong physique. Therefore, he was able to remain calm despite the intense pain. At this moment, it was obviously impossible for him to keep his promise of giving up 3 punches. The director suddenly reached out and grabbed Li Yueming's arm. He wanted to tear Li Yueming into pieces in his anger. But how could Li Yueming be so easily bullied? She grabbed his arm with her backhand and also began to exert force, wanting to use brute force to break free from the director's grip. Everything happened so quickly. In the eyes of others, it had only been a few breaths. The battle between the two had already escalated to the point where they would fight to the death. Li Yueming actually started to compete with the head in terms of strength. Whether it was the martial artists outside the door or the Westerners inside the sect, they could not help but feel their scalps go numb. In everyone's eyes, this kind of behavior was tantamount to courting death. After all, the dojo master was a Gokyudo grandmaster of combat. Whether it was in terms of strength or physique, they were all top-notch existences. And Li Yueming was just a child who had yet to reach adulthood. How could he compete with a muscular dojo master in terms of physical strength? However, before anyone could say anything, a scene that shattered everyone's worldview appeared. Li Yueming forcefully pried open the curator's arm, and under the disbelief of the curator, he turned around and hit the curator's third leg. In order to achieve the desired effect, Li Yueming had even tried his best to mobilize his breathing technique and inner qi. This attack was the strongest attack that Li Yueming had used. Crack. Another sound that made everyone's teeth ache rang out. The hall master, who was already a lone hero, rolled his eyes, and his incomparably majestic body instantly fell to the ground. Not long after, white foam came out of his mouth. It didn't seem like it was going to work. He looked at the head of the temple, who did not know if he was dead or alive. Men can't leave any weaknesses for themselves, Li Yueming said expressionlessly. Chapter 69, Accidentally Reverse the Version, please read it. He looked at the curator who was still twitching on the ground. All the martial artists and Westerners in the surroundings had their brains short-circuit for several minutes. It could only be said that everything happened too quickly. From the beginning of the battle to the moment the head lost his fighting strength, the whole process took less than 3 minutes. The fierce battle that everyone thought was going to happen did not happen. Li Yueming didn't make any extra movements except for 1 punch and 2 kicks. But it was just like this. However, he had ended the battle with just 1 punch and 2 kicks. Countless martial artists who had followed them were stunned for a long time. In the end, there was a loud cheer. At this moment, Li Yueming had already transformed from a demon god to a martial Dao perfected lord in their eyes. It brought them a long-lost light of hope. In just a short year, the Western Gokyudo fighting technique had always been a knife hanging on the necks of all the martial artists around Kingdeport. It was so heavy that they could not breathe. If it was just a simple defeat, then forget it. After all, it was not embarrassing to lose. However, what made them most desperate was that compared to the martial arts of Great Xia, the fighting techniques of the West and the baptism of the scriptures of the missionaries seemed to be much more advanced than martial arts. The abilities that they were so proud of were not worth mentioning in front of the foreigners. The Great Xia dynasty's martial arts, which had been at its peak for hundreds of years, seemed to be unable to keep up with the times. This was what made them feel the most defeated and hopeless. Li Yueming's powerful performance was like a shot in the arm for all the martial artists. He had not lost in martial arts. At the very least, there were still young people who could easily defeat Westerners with martial arts. The Chinese martial artists cheered. Many people were in tears. He wished he could roar into the sky. In contrast, the foreigners in the combat hall were relatively silent. He looked at the dojo master who was lying on the ground. Many Westerners looked dazed. They did not expect that among the Chinese martial artists that they had always looked down on, there would be a monster like Li Yueming. Although the method of victory was slightly despicable. However, Li Yueming's shocking strength and sharp judgment during the battle were still enough to shock the world. In the silence, many Westerners could not help but take a few steps back. Even the director was killed by Li Yueming. How could they still have the courage to continue attacking Li Yueming? Li Yueming didn't look relaxed. After making sure that the curator on the ground had completely lost his combat strength, he was stunned. Li Yueming didn't even dare to attack. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the black-robed old man who was still sitting not far away and reading a book. She seemed to have sensed his gaze. The old man raised his head and looked at the dojo master lying on the ground. She adjusted the silver glasses on her nose bridge. "Interesting," he said with some interest. "I didn't expect there to be such an anomaly like you in the declining Huaxia martial arts." Li Yueming looked at the old man warily. And the book in the old man's hand. The reason why he did not hesitate to use underhanded methods to end the battle as soon as possible was to prevent the old man and the head from working together. Now, he had successfully dealt with the director. The worst-case scenario would not happen. However, compared to the Gokyudo combat manager, who only knew physical attacks, this old bishop from the Western Europe was actually the source of Li Yueming's pressure. The other party held a book called the Original Bible in his hands. Although it was only one page. However, the old man could also use it to mobilize a portion of the laws of heaven and earth to launch an attack. This kind of method was an existence that only martial saints could come into contact with among martial artists. For Li Yueming, who was only a martial master, this was undoubtedly a blow that exceeded the scope of the rules. Fortunately, Li Yueming himself had some knowledge of the scriptures. He had mastered a certain amount of excessive attack methods. He had probably packed his things and ran away by now. She felt his vigilant gaze. The bishop smiled. "Young man, you don't have to be so nervous. We, the Holy Fire missionaries, are not going to be your enemies." Seeing this, Li Yueming did not let down his guard and said, "If that's the case, then please remove your hand from the page." Hearing this, the old man was surprised. The Holy Fire missionary had always kept a low profile. As a martial artist, how did Li Yueming know his attack method? The bishop finally withdrew his hand from the scripture and said, "Ask your friends to leave. How about the two of us have a private chat?" The hostility on Li Yueming's face lessened slightly. He restrained the murderous aura on his body and dismissed the disciples following behind him. Li Yueming took a few steps forward and said cheerfully, "There's an old saying in China's Central Plains. Isn't it also said that friends come from afar? Welcome to our central plains. The bishop was a little confused by his words. Friends from afar. The bishop was not stupid enough to believe such bullshit. Li Yueming was getting closer and closer. The bishop recalled Li Yueming's previous death of his legs and couldn't help but reveal a serious expression. Little friend, your behavior is undoubtedly a challenge to my patience. As a missionary, a bishop's combat power did not lie in himself. Instead, it was about the understanding of the scriptures in his hands. Once a martial artist of Li Yueming's level got close to him. Without the time to use the scriptures, the bishop was almost like an ordinary person waiting to be killed. Seeing that the sneak attack had failed, Li Yueming could only rub his nose and laugh. One can't help it, I can't help it, ha ha ha. The bishop glanced at him and moved his butt back a few inches. I'm very curious. How did you achieve all of this? After thinking for a while, Li Yueming said honestly, there doesn't seem to be anything special. If he had to say it, perhaps the physiques of people were different. The bishop obviously did not believe a single word. The decline of martial arts is the guidance of God. A new era is about to arrive. Someone like you should not appear. Li Yueming pondered for a moment. His mind suddenly cleared up. The so-called God's guidance. Could it be that this world's will is playing tricks? The decline of martial arts meant that a new era was about to arrive. Could it be that this planet was in the midst of a sequence change? Thinking of this, Li Yueming suddenly felt that many things could be explained in an instant. No wonder Fu Xiao could not achieve much in martial arts no matter how much she cultivated. Previously, he had always thought that he had mistaken the chosen one. But now, it seemed like he was the only one. In fact, Fu Xiao's destiny was not on the path of cultivating martial arts at all. According to the original trajectory of fate, Fu Xiao and her classmates would probably be sold to the Free State. Then, he would stay in the Free State to develop. So, it was equivalent to the game designer changing the game version while playing the game. Added and strengthened new heroes. Li Yueming was holding the sewer hero that had been deleted in the reverse version. What he wanted to do was to use the sewer hero to beat up the enhanced designer's son. What should be said or not, the challenge was full. Looking at the doubt in the bishop's eyes. I don't know. Li Yueming shook his head. I can't explain your problem. Even if I could, do you think I would tell you? The bishop was not surprised to hear this. I know what you mean, but I can only guarantee that the Holy Fire missionaries in Kingdeport will leave. As for the missionaries in other ports and cities, that's not up to me to decide. The white-haired bishop sighed. He staggered away. Chapter 70, Sweeping Kingdeport, Becoming City Lord from today onward. This year, Li Yueming was 9 years old. The emperor of the Great Xia Empire had died suddenly, and the production of food had been reduced frequently. This ancient empire that had ruled China for hundreds of years was on the verge of collapse under the repeated attacks. The court was troubled by both internal and external troubles. Countless demons and monsters took root and sprouted in this thick land. All of them were signs of a chaotic world. In the first half of winter, Li Yueming spent some effort to wipe out the 8 dojos of Kingdeport. In the autumn of the second half of the year, Li Yueming spent some effort to wipe out the arrogant foreigners in Kingdeport. The Free State's Gokyudo combat gym was forced to close down. A large group of Grand Masters of Combat departed dejectedly. The black-robed bishop did not go back on his word. The Sacred Fire missionary packed his things and left Kingdeport overnight. The messy forces in Kingdeport were basically eliminated by Li Yueming with absolute force. After doing all this, Li Yueming didn't disappear like he did in previous years. Instead, he began to order his disciples to take over the various powers of the entire Kingdeport. At the same time, many martial artists in Kingdeport witnessed Li Yueming's tyrannical combat strength. Almost all of them expressed their submission to him. He also expressed that he wanted to learn a higher level of martial arts from Li Yueming. Li Yueming didn't refuse. Because what he had to do next was definitely not something that he could do alone. He had to have enough people under him. However, Li Yueming didn't accept this group of martial artists easily. Instead, he set an assessment target for them. The deadline was half a year. Only by passing the test could one learn his martial arts. The group of martial artists discussed for a moment and expressed that there was no problem. Everyone had witnessed Li Yueming's combat strength. To be under such a boss. Let's not talk about anything else, let's just fill up the number of blocks, alright. Hence, he decided to do it. Under the circumstances where he had absolute power. The city lord did not even dare to show any dissatisfaction and obediently handed over all the power in his hands. Li Yueming smoothly took over the entire city. The next step. He began to dispatch officials from the government to settle the refugees at the city gate. Because of the war and famine. Around 70,000 to 80,000 refugees had gathered outside the city. When the foreigners ruled. Other than attacking the city by force, these refugees would not have any chance to enter the city even if they starved to death. Now that Li Yueming was in charge of Qingduport, he naturally wouldn't sit by and watch this happen. In times of chaos, population was a heavy burden. But for Li Yueming, as long as he could find a way to solve the most basic problem of food and accommodation, the population was absolute power. He followed the officials to the gate of the Green Capital Harbor. One of the martial artists who took the initiative to join Li Yueming shouted, "Everyone, listen up. The new city lord of the port, Li Yueming, is a kind-hearted man. From today onwards, you can queue up to register to enter the city." Their faces were filled with disbelief. The originally tightly shut gate of the Azure capital opened a crack. After the refugees confirmed that they weren't dizzy or hallucinating. They were all excited. He rushed towards the city gate as if he had gone crazy. Everyone must queue up to enter the city. Anyone who disturbs the order, spreads rumors, or incites martial arts will be killed without mercy, the martial artist continued. His voice was very loud. However, how could the refugees who had already gone crazy listen to these words? All of them ignored this. When they reached the city gate, he looked at the murderous armored soldiers in the city and the martial artists on both sides of the city gate who were full of vigor and held long sabers. He instantly calmed down. At this moment, Li Yueming was also standing at the entrance. He looked at the starving refugees. Li Yueming expressionlessly said to the soldiers and martial artists behind him, "Anyone who dares to step past the city gate will be killed immediately." He could feel the murderous aura emanating from Li Yueming's body. The restless refugees finally regained some rationality. There were also those who were not afraid of death, relying on the fact that they had more people and wanted to take this opportunity to force their way into the city. As a result, naturally, he was beheaded by the surrounding martial artists and kicked around like a ball. Finally, he hung it on the city wall as a warning. The registrar sitting next to Li Yueming kept wiping the sweat off his forehead. As the second in command of the city lord, the registrar had been in Qingduport for so many years and had seen some ruthless people. However, it was the first time he had seen someone as fierce and ruthless as Li Yueming. One had to know that there were nearly 100,000 refugees in front of him. All of them were so hungry that their eyes had turned yellow. A small mistake could cause a large-scale mutiny. Li Yueming actually opened the city gate in front of so many refugees. Even though it was only a sliver, the danger involved was unimaginable. The starving refugees were not humans. The starving refugees were like wild beasts that could choose a person to eat at any time. If it wasn't for the fact that his little life was in danger. However, under such circumstances, Li Yueming managed to suppress the chaos that was about to happen. Such ruthlessness and decisiveness really made the registrar flabbergasted. After temporarily suppressing the rioting refugees, The porridge that his cheap mother, Fuziro, and the others had prepared was carried up. The food used to cook the porridge was all confiscated by Li Yueming from the Free State's Gokyudo Path Combat Headquarters. Just the food alone had been copied out of 3 warehouses. There were countless other gold, silver, and all kinds of gold, silver, and jewelry. In Li Yueming's hands, these were just a pile of scrap metal. All of them were taken out by him to help the victims. The eyes of the disaster victims turned green when they smelled the porridge. A new round of riots was about to begin. "This is relief food," the warrior on the city gate shouted. "Every household can line up to receive it. Everyone will get a share. In addition, if there were any acts of snatching the food, they would all be killed without mercy." There were still many refugees who didn't believe in evil and rushed forward. Of course, it was also the same as the head that was hung on the city wall. Fuziro and the others were really giving out porridge. The restless refugees calmed down a little. There was food. They could even queue up to enter the city. For the refugees who had been displaced along the way, this was something that they did not even dare to dream about. Li Yueming didn't want to compromise on these 2 things. Seeing that there was hope for survival, the refugees naturally did not riot. With sticks and sweet dates, they took turns to serve him. The refugees were completely controlled by Li Yueming. Although there was still some chaos outside the city. However, there were no large-scale riots. In just one day, there were more than 3,000 refugees in Qingdu port. After verification, most of these refugees were farmers who had lost their land. During the harvest year, they depended on the local major families to farm and barely make a living. In the event of a disaster, they were the first to be abandoned by the local wealthy families. After this group of people entered the city, of course, Li Yueming wouldn't let them wander around the streets and disturb the peace. They found a boat and asked a few fishermen who were familiar with the sea to take them fishing. Unlike the famine on land, the resources in the sea were very rich. As long as the arrangements were made properly, Qingdu port could easily absorb a lot of refugees. The news of Qingdu port accepting refugees into the Guotian kingdom spread more and more. Li Yueming's name gradually became known by the people around him. The commoners in the surrounding hundreds of miles heard that there was a heavenly lord in Qingdu port. Many of the farmers who couldn't find a way to survive in their hometowns all took their families and embarked on the road to Qingdu port. In just 2 short months, almost 200,000 refugees flooded into Qingdu port. This was a very large number. As a result, many of the officials in Qingdu port were so busy that their feet did not even touch the ground. If Li Yueming hadn't given him a generous reward, he would have died. At this moment, many officials had probably already begun to dawdle. In addition, the number of refugees increased. The security problem in Qingdu port was more obvious. There were often refugees who stole the property and food of the local residents. Those who were more ruthless. There were even people who killed for money. Li Yueming immediately took out his thunderous methods. A curfew was imposed at night, and martial artists led soldiers to patrol. Kill all the sneaky guys they caught. Under this kind of high-pressure punishment, the security problem in Qingdu port was finally alleviated. The curfew was only a temporary measure. If he wanted to solve the problem fundamentally, he had to start from filling his stomach and distributing work. Li Yueming was troubled by this for a while. Large-scale reclamation of wasteland to grow food was naturally the best solution. However, it was too inefficient for the poor refugees. Moreover, the land was a famine year, so it was not suitable for growing food. Therefore, after considering everything, for the current Qingdu port, developing the ocean should be the best choice. Chapter 71, 70. The person is still alive, and the temple is already built, _L. Qingdu port was close to the coastline. Compared to the undeveloped inland areas, the terrain was undoubtedly superior. Now the natural disaster is in the way. It was obviously not suitable to open up wasteland and grow grain. After much consideration, Li Yueming finally decided to develop the ocean. The ocean was rich in resources, and transportation was very convenient. He could use the smallest cost and the fastest speed to make all the refugees wealthy. Only the residents of Kingdeport became wealthy. No longer worry about food and drink expenses. Only then would he have the foundation to implement the various systems he had envisioned. Under the circumstances of not having enough to eat, all other decrees and laws were in vain. After confirming the target, Li Yueming began to issue orders in an orderly manner. He wanted to sail. The most important thing was to build fishing boats. Li Yueming had some ready-made experience in the wasteland world in his previous life. Although it couldn't be directly applied to the world of martial Dao. However, for Li Yueming, who had unlimited deduction talent, these were only small problems. It was fine if the nuclear submarine could not be built. Can't they get a few broken fishing boats? Now, Li Yueming was the well-deserved emperor of Kingdeport. No one could go against his will. Under such a high degree of concentration of power, Kingdeport was no longer as chaotic as it used to be. It had become unprecedentedly orderly. The blueprints were distributed to the craftsmen in Kingdeport. In the beginning, when the craftsmen heard that Li Yueming wanted to teach them how to design a brand new fishing boat, they were shocked. They were basically disdainful. After all, their skills had been passed down from their ancestors. After hundreds of thousands of years of accumulation and improvement. How could a layman point fingers at her? However, due to Li Yueming's current power, the craftsmen did not dare to make a sound. However, when they received Li Moonlight's blueprint, only then did he realize that he seemed to be a little wrong. The densely packed data and straight and smooth lines on the blueprint were no current from a martial arust GMG martial arc secret manual. After repeatedly looking at it, their eyes widened. You call this a fishing boat? No matter what they thought, Li Yueming's shipbuilding business had already begun to put into production. The craftsmen were responsible for the overall progress of the project. As for the labor force, currently, the thing that Kingdeport did not lack the most was labor. They settled the hundreds of thousands of refugees. After taking care of their food, accommodation, and rest for a period of time, they would be dragged to cut down trees and build ships. When the capitalists saw this, they could only cry. However, it was in such an environment. However, the refugees were still willing to accept it and were grateful to Li Yueming, who provided them with food and accommodation. This was naturally due to the natural disasters. However, from another perspective, it also proved the tenacious character of the people of China's Central Plains. Many times, they were often the group of people who could endure the most hardships. Hard-working and simple. They believed in self-nourishment. As long as he could have a place to settle down and a job to make a living, it was enough for 80% of them to be grateful. However, on such a piece of land, they often couldn't even satisfy the most basic living conditions. Other than spending the first few months of the new year planning the development of Kingdeport, Li Yueming still spent 80% of his energy on cultivating martial arts. In a sense, Kingdeport was just an accessory to the fist. Of course, the most important thing was to constantly improve his strength. Only if one was strong enough, only then would he have enough confidence to face other unforeseen events. Li Yueming's strength was already close to the peak of the martial master realm. The reason why he hadn't broken through yet was because Li Yueming was still polishing his inner qi. If the internal qi of an ordinary martial master was like an earthworm, then, Li Yueming's inner qi was like a nine-clawed dragon. Whether it was strength or thickness, they were completely different from ordinary martial masters. Just because Li Yueming was studying martial arts didn't mean that his planned development direction had come to a halt. There were many talented people in Kingdeport's population of nearly 1 million. Li Yueming's onl needed to control the direction. All the details were left to the subordinates to worry about. A year passed. King Duport had already produced more than 50 ships. Most of these fishing boats were made of thick wooden planks. In order to ensure that the wooden planks were thick and hard enough, Li Yueming specially hired a large group of martial master realm martial artists to do assembly line forging. The martial masters used their inner chi to press the wooden planks. It could make wooden planks harder than steel. A set of streamlined operations was completed. The efficiency was shockingly high. Moreover, martial artists not only forged materials for shipbuilding. He even took this opportunity to increase his strength. It was a win-win situation. Each plank was hammered to an extremely hard state. Only then would it be installed on the fishing boat. A few parts of the fishing boat were made of steel. For example, cannons of various calibers, giant warhammers at the bow, and barbs on the deck at the bow and stern. These parts were all inlaid with martial arts master forging steel. As for why there was such strange equipment on the fishing boat, well, of course, it was to fish better. What was that? Was this reasonable? This was a Thai beaver. After all, a fishing boat that could not fire was not a good warship. Encountering foreign pirates on the way back after fishing, this was all uncertain. Compared to the chaos and killing intent a year ago. Now, King Duport had gradually recovered its prosperity as a port. If it wasn't for the frequent wars in the inner land, it would have been a disaster. The trade route was completely cut off. Perhaps the current King Duport was even more lively than a year ago. First of all, Li Yueming had been exempted from many taxes after taking office. This method of benefiting the people was very effective. The entire King Duport seemed to come alive overnight. All the merchants were more enthusiastic when they saw Li Yueming than when they saw their own father. Many chaotic forces in King Duport, including martial artists, had been wiped out by Li Yueming a year ago. In addition, there was a curfew for half a year. The crime rate in the entire King Duport had almost dropped off a cliff. The martial artists and foreigners who used to be domineering had disappeared. The foreigners who committed all kinds of evil deeds had disappeared from the physical world. The tyrannical martial artists disappeared from the spiritual level. Li Yueming's disciples didn't care if the criminal was a martial artist or a commoner. As long as he was caught, he would be dealt with according to the law. After being taught a lesson many times, the martial artists of King Duport quickly became well behaved. All of them became docile little karami. This set of punches came down. The entire King Duport, including the martial artists, was under Li Yueming's control. He couldn't refuse. Li Yueming's disrespectful disciples dared to kill them like pigs. As for the evaluation of Li Yueming by the refugees outside the city, that would be even higher. If Li Yueming hadn't opened the city gate to let them in back then, they had probably starved to death on the grassland where even the grass roots had been chewed up. After entering the city, Li Yueming not only divided a living area for them, they even organized people to help them rebuild their homes. Later on, they were provided with food that was enough for them to survive. The group of refugees went out to sea. It was about building ships. Although he was still poor, but at the very least, he did not have to worry about starving to death. And most importantly, in such a city, for the first time, they experienced what it felt like to be human. Not only did he have his own household registration, every once in a while, there would be officials visiting them to inquire about their living conditions. Even martial artists did not dare to shout at them on the road. This was because they enjoyed the same human rights as martial artists. As long as there was a conflict, the government would definitely judge the case impartially. They would not be biased just because the other party was a martial artist who broke the law. The refugees were grateful to Li Yueming from the bottom of their hearts. Many refugees even called Li Yueming the Son of Heaven. It was the existence that the heavens had listened to the prayers of the people and led them, the bitter commoners, from suffering to glory. In the center of the area where the refugees lived, someone even built a temple for Li Yueming. He would pay his respects every year. Fu Xiao's face darkened when she heard about this. As Li Yueming's disciple, it was naturally a good thing for his master to be loved. But now, he was building a temple before he died? What kind of bullsh*t was this? Chapter 72, Japan. 1. After the situation stabilized, Li Yueming began to promote free dojos and free schools. Wang Ermei's family used to study literature. Later, he was forced by his father to learn martial arts. However, she had never given up on learning literature as her hobby. He had become the first literature teacher in Qinggang University. Li Yueming would occasionally teach when he had time. However, Wang Ermei was in charge of the university most of the time. There weren't many disciples studying in the literature hall. After all, Huaxia's tradition of valuing martial arts over literature was deeply rooted in their bones. It would be difficult to turn things around in a short period of time. A free martial arts hall was also opened. Except for Fu Xiao. The other 15 disciples were entrusted with important tasks and began to teach the children martial arts. Of course, the martial artists of Qingduport could also enter to learn. However, they weren't included in Li Yueming's free 5-year compulsory education. Adult martial artists had to pay if they wanted to attend classes. However, the martial arts hall was still packed with people. On the day of the opening, almost all the martial artists in the port came. Everyone wanted to see how Li Yueming's proud disciples were able to achieve invincible combat strength at the same level. Qingduport was extremely lively. Compared to the frenzied development of Qingduport, the fate of the Great Xia dynasty was somewhat miserable. The emperor died suddenly before he could confer the title of crown prince. He left a huge mess for the officials. The old emperor was dead. Logically speaking, the throne should be succeeded by the 10-year-old eldest son. However, the eldest son was not the empress's biological son. The empress's biological son was her second son, who was only 9 years old. The empress's family was a complicated aristocratic family, whether it was in the court or in the local area. Its power spread throughout the country and was incomparably powerful. Naturally, he would not watch the throne fall into the hands of outsiders. A battle for the throne began. The followers of the eldest son, who abided by the rules of propriety, tried their best to ensure that the eldest son succeeded to the throne. The queen's faction, led by the queen, wanted to send the second son to that supreme position. The two sides fought for half a year. In the end, the empress's family won a great victory. The second son of the emperor announced his succession that year. But the problem was that he had an emperor. As a result, the Great Xia Empire lost its last bit of cohesion. There were bandits everywhere in China, and there were white bones everywhere. In order to survive, countless commoners sold their children and exchanged their sons for food. It was a living hell. The central government no longer had the power to restrain the local government. The era of chaos had arrived. There was another thing worth mentioning. The foreigners had not been idle during this year. Taking advantage of the internal strife in the royal family, they quietly took down 6 ports of Great Xia. The coastline was filled with traces of foreigners from the south to the north. The Holy Fire missionaries continued to build churches, while the Gokyudo fighters opened combat centers everywhere. Huaxia's local martial arts were being devoured by them. He didn't even have a few decent counterattacks. It was basically a one-sided massacre. Such an arrogant foreigner made all the martial arts sects in China feel a huge threat. It was said that the top 5 sects in China were already discussing countermeasures. As for when they would be able to come up with a feasible plan, that was unknown. All of this had nothing to do with Li Yueming. Now, he was living in Qingdu Harbor to develop. As long as the storm outside did not affect his head, he was prepared to ignore it. The martial apprentice realm focused on polishing the body. The martial master realm focused on training one's inner qi. After a year of continuous deduction and connection, Li Yueming had already trained his inner qi to the peak of perfection. Now, as long as he spat out his inner qi, he could send a boulder weighing over 10,000 pounds flying with one blow. Even if they were tens of meters apart. He could also easily kill people with a raise of his hand. After cultivating to this stage, logically speaking, Li Yueming could already advance to a higher level martial king. However, Li Yueming felt that something was missing. As a genius with martial arts talent, he was extremely talented. That was why he was able to reach his current level without any strict guidance from his master. His intuition told him that he was still one step away from the great circle of the martial master realm. That meant that he was still one step away. It was definitely not wrong. For ordinary people, a step away was just a step away. After all, no one could polish all the realms to perfection. A step away was naturally intolerable. 10 years old, this year, a big one. Li Yueming locked himself in his room to deduce what step he was missing. But even if it took a whole year, in the end, he still found nothing. Moreover, he realized that the more he deduced and pursued, the more he would be able to do so. The so-called perfection was more illusory. No matter what, he couldn't grasp that thread of transcendence. What happened? Why couldn't he perfect his martial master realm? Could it be that the perfect martial path had been cut off by the world's will? Li Yueming was confused. It was impossible to polish it to transcendence and perfection. For someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder like him, it was like ants crawling on his body. However, he was very sure that the reason for this situation was not because of him. After thinking about it, there was only one possibility. That was the change in the world's will. Martial artists and martial arts had gradually become a thing of the past in the planning of the world's will. Li Yueming could only temporarily give up on the idea of pursuing perfection. He walked out of the house where he was in seclusion. Li Yueming was already 11 years old. At this moment, his face was delicate and his long hair was like ink. Even if he was only wearing plain clothes, there was also an ethereal aura in his every move. He opened the door. Over the years, Li Yueming and his disciples had disappeared from the courtyard. His cheap mother would still farm here. Occasionally, he would even send some ducks and other things to the children who were cultivating to nourish their bodies. The group of disciples would come back for a few days every half a month. As his master, Li Yueming had been in seclusion all this time. As adopted children, they naturally had to bear the responsibility of taking care of their cheap mother. Moreover, their cheap mother's kindness to them was the most simple and genuine. It was not mixed with any benefits. This was also a feeling that was difficult for the disciples to part with. However, they were currently busy teaching martial arts to the children of King Duport. Therefore, every time he came, he would be in a hurry. He looked at his mother, who was plucking the weeds in the yard not far away. Li Yueming silently watched the situation for a long time. In the end, he did not say anything and turned to leave the courtyard. Li Yueming arrived at the city lord's mansion in King Duport. Hundreds of thousands of refugees settled down. King Duport was changing every day. There were already more than 1,000 fishing boats in King Duport, and the nearby waters were filled with fishing boats. The wasteland around the city wall had also been reclaimed. After all, agriculture was the foundation of the Chinese people. The harvest from the fishing industry could be regarded as a side business. The fundamental problem of food had to be solved by the traditional skill of farming. When Li Yueming stepped into the city lord's mansion, Fu Xiao's angry voice came from the city lord's mansion. Due to his poor talent, Fu Xiao struggled a few times before she finally chose to give up on practicing martial arts. He then turned to Li Yueming as his assistant. As his disciple, Fu Xiao could feel Li Yueming's imposing manner. Similarly, she also understands that she is going to be. His master would one day be famous. Although King Duport looked prosperous and orderly. However, the relationship between Li Yueming and all of them stemmed from interests and absolute military suppression. Fu Xiaoro felt that this kind of relationship was very unreliable. After some thought, she gritted her teeth and made the decision to give up martial arts. In Fu Xiaoro's eyes, as long as she, as his disciple, was here to suppress him, the officials and martial artists of King Duport would not dare to lie to Li Yueming. This was undoubtedly a huge sacrifice for Fu Xiaoro, who wanted to be strong. However, it relieved a lot of pressure on Li Yueming. Now, she was basically responsible for the meticulous implementation of the direction that Li Yueming pointed out. There was actually someone who dared to make Fu Xiaoro so angry. It was definitely a great provocation to Li Yueming. At the same time, Fu Xiaoro heard the sound outside the door. He looked over with a puzzled expression. The city lord's mansion was the most heavily guarded place in the entire King Duport. Logically speaking, no one should be able to get close to her without alerting anyone. He looked over. He realized that it was Li Yueming. Fu Xiaoro was pleasantly surprised. Disciple Fu Xiaoro greets master. She knelt on the ground and said excitedly. Li Yueming waved his hand to signal her to get up. After finding a seat, he said, "Who made you unhappy? I'll help you vent your anger." Fu Xiaoro pouted. Recently, a group of Japanese warriors have been burning, killing, and looting near our King Duport. Many of the crops planted outside the city haven't even matured yet and were destroyed by these damn pirates. At this moment, her face was still a little immature. However, she had already begun to show the appearance of a young girl. This kind of expression would only appear in front of Li Yueming. Usually, in order to make herself look mature, Fu Xiaoro was usually expressionless. Li Yueming suddenly became very interested. He smiled and said, "The Japanese samurai, Japanese pirates? I didn't expect that there would be such an EXP baby near Green City." Chapter 73, As long as there are enough fishing boats, the sea is full of truth. 1. Li Yueming's main goal was naturally to pursue a higher level of martial arts. He had already polished his martial master realm to the peak. Even though it was unable to be polished to perfection under the obstruction of the world's will. However, with his accumulation, it was more than enough for him to advance to a martial king. But before that, he had to solve the food crisis in King Duport first. In the past 2 years, the development of King Duport had been extremely rapid. The reason why it was so smooth. Li Yueming's thunderous methods were part of the reason. The other reason was that Li Yueming had been paying for food. With so many refugees pouring into King Duport, they wanted to digest them into the driving force for economic and population growth. The most important thing was not to lack food. Fortunately, when Li Yueming became the city lord, there was still a lot of food stored in the granary of the King Duport government. There were also a lot of them stored in the warehouses of the foreigners. After looting the 2 batches of food, Li Yueming distributed them to the refugees. This was how the people of King Duport were barely able to maintain their stability. This kind of food subsidy had continued until now. Even if King Duport was really a super granary, it could not withstand the fact that it could only produce and not import for years. Not to mention that King Duport itself did not produce grain. The number of refugees in the port was constantly increasing, and it was not yet time to harvest the grain planted in the fields. The inland was also the year of the Great Wilderness. All the places were fighting. The economic and social order had long been in a mess. Even if they had money, they couldn't buy a grain of grain from the mainland. Since the beginning of the year, the prices of rice and wheat in the grain shops of King Duport had been rising for several months. If it weren't for the fishing boats at the port that were still working, the food supply at King Duport might have already run out. When he heard that the Japanese warriors had destroyed the newly planted rice fields, He was shocked. That was why Fuziro was so angry. She was already worried to death because of the lack of food. This group of dogs still brought up the matter. She was so angry that her blood pressure almost rose. After listening to her report, Li Yueming pondered for a moment and suddenly smiled. Japanese pirates, right? Have you found out where their nest is? Originally, he was still thinking about how to quickly get some food and resources to solve his urgent needs. He didn't expect the Japanese pirates to give him a good start as soon as he entered the city. Eldest senior brother left the city 2 days ago to chase after the culprit, Fuziro replied. If nothing unexpected happens, there should be a result soon. The East Ocean was a small island in the eastern sea of Grand Xia. In the past, Japan had always been a vassal state that submitted to Great Xia. He had gotten a lot of benefits from Great Xia. Now that Great Xia had weakened, they began to use small fishing boats to frequently attack the villages near the coast. The Japanese who only knew how to seek help from others would definitely become more and more rampant. Therefore, he had no choice. After hearing the news, Han Bufan, who had already broken through to the martial master realm, brought his men to find trouble with those Japanese pirates. He heard the answer. A few years ago, he had rescued this group of children from the cages of the foreigners. After careful nurturing, this group of children had already shown their talents. He had the ability to take charge of his own affairs. Eldest senior brother Han Bufan naturally did not need to say anything. Whether it was his temperament or martial arts talent, he was first class. His combat strength was also one of the best among all the disciples. The other disciples were also very outstanding. 2 days later, Han Bufan and a dozen other martial artists returned to Qingdu Harbor with the heads of over 30 East Asian men. They hung the heads of the East Asian people on the city gate tower of Qingdu Harbor according to tradition. Then, he brought the remaining captive to Li Yueming. When I saw Li Yueming, Han Bufan knelt down respectfully and kowtowed, "Disciple greets master." Li Yueming waved his hand, indicating that there was no need to be so polite. His gaze landed on the ragged Japanese behind Han Bufan and asked, "I'll give you a chance to live. Tell me, where is your East Ocean island?" The Japanese had a blank expression. He glanced at Li Yueming. He then looked at Han Bufan behind him. She opened her mouth and whispered after a while, "Baka Yalu." Hearing this bird language, Li Yueming then remembered that there was a language barrier between them. Since that was the case, then it was over. The Japanese captives were taken away. Li Yueming looked at Fuziro, and many fishing boats are there in Qingdu port. Fuziro tilted her head when she heard this. There should be close to 2,000 ships in use now. He nodded. Li Yueming thought for a moment and said, "Mobilize all the fishermen and fishing boats. Find the location of Japan at all costs." "Yes, master." "But why are you looking for the location of Japan, master?" Fuziro asked with a puzzled expression. Li Yueming smiled and said, "Lsnt the city short of money and food now. I heard that Japan is a famous silver country." He looked at Li Yueming's expressionless smile. Fuziro thought for a moment. He suddenly felt as if he had opened the door to a new world. The so-called fishing boats were all high-grade goods equipped with super cannons. Although they might not be able to gain the upper hand against the warships of Western Europe and the Free State. However, when facing a small country like Japan that relied on fishing and farming for a living, wouldn't that be a huge blow? It was simply a waste of natural resources to use it only for fishing. Fuziro did not hesitate anymore. He turned around and began to arrange these matters. It took half a month. The fishing boat at Qingdu port had figured out the location of Japan. After carefully gathering information about the East Ocean country, he was able to find out more about the East Ocean country. Fuziro began to mobilize more than 2,000 fishing boats in Qingdu port. On a sunny afternoon, the fishing boats gave up on traditional fishing and headed towards Japan. About half a month later, countless people were looking forward to it. The fishing boat was loaded with all kinds of supplies. The harbor of Kingdeport was piled up with heavy boxes. Countless people gathered together to celebrate. He was immersed in the joy of the harvest. As expected, stealing was better than robbing, and robbing was better than ransacking. It felt so good to go to someone else's house and act out the act of happiness knocking on the door. He had earned a lot of money just by coming to Kingdeport. Not only did it greatly alleviate the food crisis, they even brought back countless amounts of iron and silver. If it wasn't for the fact that it was currently in a chaotic world, these ores were enough for Green Harbor to develop. Li Yueming didn't show much surprise. According to his plan, these fishing boats were built with some of the functions of warships. When he had nothing to do, he would fish in the coastal waters to make a living. If there was a need, these black technology fishing boats that had been forged by the inner Qi assembly line of martial masters would turn into ferocious and terrifying beasts. He killed the enemies on the sea. The fishing boats that were currently in service. It was only the lowest level of the black technology fishing ship series. Once Kingdeport had a firm foothold, Li Yueming would also develop a super martial artist's black technology warship with higher combat power. At that time, the so-called Sea of Stars would only be within reach. The grain harvested from the East Ocean island was sold at a low price, and the urgent need for grain in Kingdeport was instantly extinguished by more than half. As for the iron and silver mines, Li Yueming waved his hand and put all of them into the fishing boat production line. Towards this decision, all the residents of Kingdeport expressed their support. My neighbor is my granary. As long as there were enough fishing boats. The sea was full of truth. Chapter 74, Wine and meat stink in Vermilion Gates, frozen bones on the road. After solving the most pressing food problem, the development of Kingdeport was back on track. However, the people who had tasted the sweetness became even more hard-working. They rubbed their fists. He wanted to build more versions of fishing boats as soon as possible. It was to prepare for the next time he went out to sea to catch a big fish. On the other hand, Li Yueming also put his focus back on advancing his martial arts realm. Martial artists were divided into 6 realms: martial apprentice, martial master, martial king, martial grandmaster, martial emperor, and martial saint. Among them, martial apprentice physique refinement. A martial arts master cultivates qi. As for the martial kings, who were of a higher rank than martial masters, he needed to refine his bones and skin. By tempering every inch of skin and every bone on their body to the point where they could not be damaged by iron or sabers, martial artists could transcend the scope of ordinary humans and possess inhuman strength that could topple mountains. The martial king realm was the dividing line between martial artists and ordinary people. Martial apprentices and martial masters were not beyond the scope of human understanding. In that case, a martial king would have truly stepped into a brand new realm. King Wu could easily fight 100 or 1,000 enemies alone. A high-level martial king was not just a joke. For Li Yueming, tempering his innate ability was nothing difficult. After all, when he was still a martial apprentice, he had already trained his physique to the peak of humanity. At most, a martial king would only be able to further polish and strengthen the foundations of the current situation. The most critical problem that prevented Li Yueming from breaking through to the martial king realm was that there were not enough martial king realm cultivation techniques for reference and deduction. The martial arts manuals collected from the 8 dojos could only be used by martial masters. He wanted to break through further. Li Yueming had to collect more martial arts manuals. Kingdeport was located in Lingnan. It was a relatively remote port in southern China. Most of the branches in the surroundings were second-rate martial arts sects like the 8 great sections. Li Yueming wanted to collect martial king realm cultivation techniques. They could either take a boat to the north and head to the largest port in southern China, which was more than 3,000 nautical miles away. Otherwise, they could only attack the second-rate sects near Lingnan. After some consideration, Li Yueming still decided to prioritize the 8 surrounding sections. Of course, this was not because he was afraid. It was because King Duport seemed to be an iron plate on the surface. But in fact, it was only because he was in the city. Ever since the dojo was chased out of Qingdu Harbor, the Lingnan sects had never given up on their evil intentions. After all, King Duport had always been the territory of the major sections. Every year, the dojo would select more than 10 talented disciples for them. They could also easily earn a huge sum of money for them. He had lost such a big piece of fat meat for nothing. How could they give up so easily? The reason why he hadn't done anything was because he had been waiting for the first time. It was only because the 8 great sects had never been able to figure out Li Yueming's background. Hence, he was afraid. Once he left, under the influence of the 8 great sections, King Duport would soon be in chaos again. Regardless of whether it was in the short term or the long term. To him, the 8 great sects were like a dark lightning that could explode at any moment. With Li Yueming's personality, knowing that the other party would explode, it was naturally impossible to let him lurk under their noses. Li Yueming, Fu Xiaoro, and the other disciples went home to have dinner with their cheap mother. After dinner, he called Wang Ermeize, who had already become a teacher. It was just like how he had traveled to Qingdu Harbor from the Li residence in Clear Spring Town several years ago. He asked Wang Ermeize to find a carriage for him. Before dawn, a man and a servant boarded the carriage and disappeared from Qingdu Harbor. The two of them headed west along the main road outside the city. He walked in the direction of Lingnan. It was said that the spiritual energy in the mountains in the middle of China was more abundant, and it was more suitable for martial artists to cultivate than other areas. Therefore, most of the famous sects and sects had their headquarters on the famous mountains and rivers in the inland. Each of them occupied a few mountains and stood aloof from the world. On the way, he looked at Li Yueming, who was already showing his youthful appearance. "Young master, I didn't expect that I, Wang Ermeize, would have the chance to lead your horse again," Wang Ermeize said with a complicated expression. Hearing this, Li Yueming glanced at the two of them and said, "Why do you say that?" Wang Ermeize smiled and said, "I'm already over 40 years old this year. It's hard for me to make any progress in martial arts. Young master, you are still young. In the future, you might be able to walk to the end of martial arts and explore the traces and fate of martial artists in a few years. I probably won't even be qualified to lead your horse." Hearing this, life was a process of constant farewells. In the middle, someone would get on the car, and someone would get off the ash. There were many things that he needed to be clear about. There was no need to say more. Wang Ermeize didn't continue the topic after feeling sad for a while. He looked around and suddenly said, "Young master, we're already near Gulu town. Do you want to go back and take a look?" The entire Gulu town. The only thing Li Yueming cherished was his mother, who had brought him up painstakingly. He had already brought his cheap mother to Qingdu Harbor. As for the others, to Li Yueming, all of them were just insignificant passers-by. From the day he left the house, the two of them had long severed all ties. The two of them continued on their way. The further inland they went, the more miserable the surrounding environment became. On both sides of the road, there were white bones that had not been buried. Many of the corpses had died not long ago. It had just rotted. The surface of the zombie was also a blur. Many parts had been torn apart and were covered in densely packed teeth marks. He didn't know if it was eaten by a nearby wolf or something more disgusting. The two of them passed by several villages along the way. However, most of the villages were empty. The houses made of mud were still there, but the villagers had no idea where they had gone. There were still some villagers living in a few villages. However, the doors were basically closed. When he passed by, He could only feel the hungry gazes of the surrounding people. Li Yueming would occasionally poke his head out to check. At the back, Li Yueming simply closed the curtain of the carriage. Out of sight, out of mind. The nearest Lingnan sect to Qingduport was about 1,000 kilometers away. If nothing unexpected happened, it would take 10 days for the carriage to arrive. During the first 3 days of departure from Qingduport, Li Yueming did not encounter any trouble. The situation of the bandits around them was not serious. However, the further inland they went, the more miserable the situation was, the more malicious gazes there were. Along the way, the two of them killed several groups of bandits who had killed and robbed them. However, Li Yueming didn't have to do most of the work himself. Wang Ermeize, who had already become a martial master this year, could easily deal with them. In the 9th day, the time when the law is being obeyed, the two of them finally arrived at the foot of the southern ridge. They were less than 100 miles away from the nearest section. When the two of them passed by a farmland, they saw an unbelievable scene. Not far away, a few acres of farmland were filled with flowers and plants. Many of the flowers were blooming and looked dazzling and beautiful. This was completely different from the devastation that Li Yueming had seen along the way. It was like two completely different worlds. Wang Ermeize was also a little surprised by this. To be able to see a flourishing flower field in such a world where the city walls were empty and the wilderness was covered with bones was even rarer than pulling out gold from a manure pit. However, the two of them did not have the time to appreciate it. A strong man walked out of the flower field with a vigilant expression. After sizing up the carriage, he rebuked angrily, "What are you looking at? This is the red and white moon orchid that the flower sex elder likes the most. If you dare to look at it again, I'll gouge out your eyes." Wang Ermeize immediately stood up and prepared to explain. Li Yueming stopped him at the crucial moment. He glanced at the flower field. There were two different flowers planted in the middle. One of the flowers was as red as blood, dazzling and eye-catching. The other type of flower was pure white and stood aloof from the world. Even with Li Yueming's aesthetic standards, these two flowers were top-notch beautiful flowers. However, it could be planted on the side of the road that was covered in bones. However, it was extremely dazzling no matter how one looked at it. Li Yueming waved his sleeve lightly. The energy in his body gushed out and sent half of the flowers flying. His fingers were like blades. Slash down. The martial master realm expert was also torn apart like a piece of white paper. He looked at the messy and devastated flower field. Li Yueming touched his chin thoughtfully and said, "That's more like it." Flower sect. They were the last of the 12 sects in Lingnan. It was also one of the sects that Li Yueming was preparing to visit. Chapter 75, First Battle, Flower Sect. They continued to move forward along the path. The plants planted on both sides of the road also changed. The reason why the flower sect was called the flower sect. It was not only because most of the disciples in the sect were women. It was also because the elders of his sect liked some strange flowers. The closer they got to the flower sect's territory, the more flowers were planted in the surrounding farmland. Li Yueming was still interested in poking his head out to take a look. "I'm too lazy to watch the rest of the game. No matter how beautiful the flowers were. However, if there were white bones all over the ground next to him, how good could it be?" On the 11th day, the two of them arrived dozens of miles away from the flower sect. Li Yueming, who was meditating in the carriage, suddenly felt a jolt. After Wang Ermeize stopped the carriage, he lifted the curtain and said, "Young master, the bandits ahead are charging towards us." Hearing his words, Li Yueming poked his head out of the carriage. On the muddy main road not far away, a group of ragged bandits carrying hoes and carrying poles were rushing towards the carriage. Rather than calling these people bandits, it was more like the people in the nearby villages who could not survive because of the lack of basic food and the lack of harvest from farming. With nowhere to go, they started to rob and kill people along the way. He looked at the skinny men, women, and children not far away. It was meaningless to discuss morality and rationality with them. Only by using the most ruthless and brutal methods could he intimidate everything. Li Yueming lifted the curtain and threw a punch. Compared to a year ago, now, Li Yueming's strength was more than a level stronger. Although it was just a simple punch. However, with the combination of the inner qi in his body and Li Yueming's self-created cultivation method, the power of this punch was extremely terrifying. Two streams of energy as thick as dragons shot out from his sleeves, and the incomparably powerful impact directly sent the 30 or so bandits who were charging at the front flying. The entire group of refugees was in chaos. This was under the condition that Li Yueming didn't intend to kill anyone. If they really wanted to make a move, the punch just now was not as simple as sending him flying. Most of the refugees would probably have their qi jin turned into broken parts with missing limbs. Two streams of dragon-like energy flew out from Li Yueming's sleeves. Dozens of people were sent flying. Such a method was enough to suppress all the refugees who had evil intentions. He looked at Li Yueming who was beside the carriage. The refugees all looked terrified. Many people knelt down and begged, "I didn't mean to offend you, exalted immortal. Please spare my life." As a group of illiterate refugees, it was obviously impossible for them to understand the realm of martial artists. In their eyes, Li Yueming was able to hit the bull from afar. This was undoubtedly the means of an immortal. Li Yueming did not explain. Standing alone on the carriage, he looked down at the refugees in ragged clothes and said, "Let me ask you, how do we get to the flower sect?" The map in Li Yueming's hands only recorded the approximate location of the flower sect. But where exactly was it? The map could not describe it clearly. If he wanted to find the exact location of the flower sect, he would have to ask this group of local refugees to show him the way. Hearing the words flower sect, the group of refugees looked at each other. No one dared to step forward to answer the question. Under Li Yueming's murderous gaze, finally, someone braced himself and said, "Exalted immortal, this lowly one dares to ask, you why are you going to the flower sect?" Wang Ermeza thought for a moment and continued, "My young master has admired the flower sect for a long time. Today, he passed by this place and specially came to pay a visit." Her scalp went numb from his ferocious gaze. The refugee who spoke hurriedly knelt on the ground and claimed to be terrified. It could be seen. The surrounding refugees hated and feared the flower sect. They hated the fact that the flower sect would send disciples to buy land every time they were in famine. Currently, the land near the flower sect was basically filled with flowers and plants. They were afraid of the ruthless disciples of the flower sect. When it came to slaughtering ordinary people, it was ferocious and brutal. When they heard that Li Yueming wanted them to lead the way, almost all the refugees refused. After all, the flower sect was usually calm and indifferent, as if they did not care about the mortal world. However, in reality, he had done many outrageous things in the local area. Many refugees did not dare to provoke the flower sect disciples at all. But in the end, under Wang Ermeza's coercion and enticement, the refugees could only brace themselves and lead the way for Li Yueming. Such a large group of people was walking on the road. It was impossible to not attract attention. 2 hours later, Li Yueming saw a dozen women in pink clothes appear on the muddy road. The women were all beautiful, and their bodies were slender and slender. She looked like a dewy hibiscus. When they saw Li Yueming's carriage from afar, a group of women smiled and said, "Young master, may I know why you have come all the way to our flower sect?" The carriage stopped. When the refugees who led the way saw the group of women, they immediately dispersed. Only a few of the bravest refugees dared to hide not far away and peek. Li Yueming walked out of the carriage and glanced at them. "I'm here to borrow the cultivation technique of your flower sect. What do you think? The group of women obviously did not expect Li Yueming to be so straightforward. After being stunned for a moment, Mama Chang chuckled and said, I see. We disciples can't decide if we want to borrow cultivation techniques. Why don't young master come up the mountain with us and ask the elders? The women all had a nice floral fragrance on them. A faint fragrance lingered around the tip of her nose, and her smile was seductive. If it were any other ordinary man, he would probably have been unable to hold on by now. However, Li Yueming was more immune to such things. Women. A creature that would only disturb training and a promotion. Crawl. Li Yueming sat back in the carriage and said, in that case, I'll obey your orders. Please lead the way. The dozen or so flower sect women revealed surprised expressions. In the beginning, they thought that they could easily manipulate Li Yueming. They already had no bottom in their hearts. One had to know that the fragrance on their bodies was the pollen of the Joya silk burning desire flower. As long as a healthy man smells a little bit, he will be fascinated by them. From then on, he will be willing to let them command and dominate him. However, Li Yueming's face was expressionless. It was as if he was not interested in them at all. This was undoubtedly abnormal. Was this normal-looking young master in front of him a eunuch or a fan of Long Yang? The group of women were confused. But no matter what, as long as he followed them to the flower sect. Even if Li Yueming really had 3 heads and 6 arms, it would be difficult for him to escape the fate of being squeezed dry by the elders and thrown into the alchemy furnace to become the medicinal catalyst for the youth-retaining pill. After thinking about it clearly, the group of women didn't say anything else and continued to lead the way. In order to prevent Li Yueming from escaping halfway, the positions occupied by the dozen or so women were also very particular. No matter which direction Li Yueming wanted to escape from, there would be at least 3 women outside the carriage who would be able to react quickly and work together to take him down. Part 4 of the series ends here. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe so we can be motivated to make even better videos in the future.